All right, salam alaikum, man.
Walaikum assalam.
How are you?
I'm good.
It's good
Alhamdulillah.
to
How
talk
are
to
you
you, man.
doing?
I feel like it's been forever since we talked like this, seeing each other face to face.
Yeah.
All right, so this is my good friend Hamzah Raza. I guess I should introduce him first because I'm not sure how many of you viewers know him. Basically, I'll let him introduce himself, but I'll just speak about how we know each other. So, as you well know by now, I studied in Qasid Arabic Institute. Well, I studied in Jordan generally, but specifically the place was Qasid. And I walked into the orientation not knowing a single person. And I look over and I see Mr. Hamza walk in the room. And I thought, I know this guy. Where do I know him from? I knew that I never met you in person, but you were familiar to me. And I thought, wait a minute, he's from that Instagram account. Do you remember that Instagram account?
I remember this time vividly.
So
'Cause
there was an Instagram account that was going around on my friend's stories called Crooked Molana. And I specifically had a few questions, like something roasting a kid about a shisha lounge, and some kid was worried about this, some girl wanting to study with him to do zina or something like that, and you were just like roasting these kids. And then you went to Umrah and you cleaned up your act and you deleted it. But I recalled you from that account, although I don't think I remembered specifically that account when I saw you. But anyway, I sat next to you and just we instantly hit it off, and the rest is history. And if you'll recall, actually that day I had a really weird uncle mustache. Did you remember that?
all what I remember is like there was free food, and I was really happy. I was like, oh wow, Qasid's lit. Like, 'cause I'd been in Qasid before,
There
and
was
like
no
I
free
was like,
food at the
like
time.
I love this place. This is like my second home. Like orientation again. So I
No,
get
so
there,
yeah.
and I'm getting my food, and then some dude just comes up, and it's you, and you're like, "Hey, I recognize you from Instagram, this, and this," and I'm just like, "Whoa,
Had that
how
ever
did?"
happened to you? Had you been recognized before?
No, it never happened to me. And
That
then
was
I
the
remember,
first.
as we were sitting there, the orientation talk that the executive director gave, it was the same talk that I heard when I was at college 4 years prior,
The
and then I was
same
like,
exact one.
"Wow, this
If
is
it
like his
ain't
20th time giving this
if it
talk."
ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, to explain the original comment, I guess you forgot. Thankfully, it wasn't that memorable. But that night, the night before, I walked from my apartment to West El Beled, if you can believe that. We've done this walk before. It's been an hour and a half to buy a shaver, but apparently, a shaving kit I bought didn't have the levels. It was just a basic shaver with no attachments, and I
Uh-huh.
didn't realize that until I cut into my beard. So I was like, all right, part of the beard's gone. It's all got to go. But I kept my mustache, of course. So I looked like one of those WhatsApp uncles. Like make a great first impression on people. But then right after we met each other, he was like, where are we going to go after this? And he took me to a Zawiya near Qasid. At the time, I wasn't expecting anything for Jordan as far as the Sufi community would go. So that was very interesting to see. And I was so happy to have run into him because he had already been to Jordan. So he kind of knew the ropes and he showed me around. And I was very blessed to have that experience. But now here we are, I think almost exactly a year later because we started in May, but it doesn't feel like a year. It feels like I've known you for much longer than that. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
So the purpose of this video is to learn more about you, inshallah, and so the viewers can learn more. I think you have a very interesting perspective on a lot of things. You've studied in various places. You have a lot of different experiences. So, inshallah, we have like a list of topics, and I guess we'll just start with the first one. So you can talk about yourself when you were younger and your Islamic identity and your perception of it.
Uh-huh. So I grew up with like fairly religious like Muslim parents. They were
Mm.
practicing, they were very spiritual and that sort of stuff. But my parents weren't exactly, I guess you would say, like experts on Islam. They were very much like average Muslims.
Where is this? When and what? Can you give the when and where?
So I was born in New York, and that's where I lived until I was 4. And then I lived in Georgia from when I was 4 to when I was 10. And this is where I feel like my religious experiences were the most formative.
Wait, you lived in Georgia? I thought you lived in New Jersey your whole life.
No, no, no. I lived in Augusta, Georgia, and then I also lived in Maryland and then in New Jersey.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay, that's new.
Yeah. So I've
All
been
right.
all over the East Coast. And
Nice, nice.
yeah, and my parents were like they weren't exactly like ulama. They weren't people who were very learned in the deen, but they were
Mhm,
people who held religion in very high regard, and it was something very important for that to them, and it was
mhm,
something in turn important for me and my siblings. So and I remember it was really weird because I I obviously grew up in this sort of secular society where religion isn't all that important, and it's becoming less and less important in society.
Yeah, by the day, really, it is.
Yeah, so there was almost sort of like this difference in private and public religious life. Whereas in public, you were told that, religion isn't all that important. It's something you do on Sundays, but when you come to third grade, you're not coming here as a Muslim or as a Christian or
As
as
an
a Jewish
American.
person. Yeah, you're just coming there I don't even think of it was like as an American. It was just like, you're just there as a third grader. And,
Yeah, you
and,
don't really have this conception in third grade of what race and nationality and identity and all that stuff is.
yeah. So, and it was kind of understood that, if you go to church, if you go to the mosque, like that's okay, but it's not something that should affect your day-to-day actions.
Yeah.
Whereas when I went to Sunday school and through my parents and stuff, I was taught that, Islam is not just a religion, but it's a deen. And a deen means that it's a way of life.
And they
So,
will also say madhab, which really means the
yeah,
path of walking, where you walk from zahaba.
yeah,
So it's
exactly.
not just one day a week, it's always.
Yeah, it's always. And I really like this idea that the the way that I conduct myself in class with my classmates should reflect,
Yeah.
the sunnah of the Prophet
Yeah, it's
Muhammad.
informed by your religion. That's why the extreme example, I guess, that you could look at, like The Sopranos or something, where they'd be killing people during the week and going to strip clubs, and then they'd go confess their sins. Or even an average American person, during the week they do all the things that are disallowed according to Christianity. If you ask conservative Christians, they don't drink, they don't, have premarital sex, they believe, loans are haram. It says be no lender nor debtor, things like that. They have so many rules in the Bible, but they ignore them all. They get tattoos, they eat shellfish, whatever, etc. But then on that one day they go and they're Christian, but then the 6 other days, they're an average a secular American.
Mhm.
So whereas we don't have that. That's almost like a meme, would be a meme to us if you were Muslim just on Jummah. I mean, we kind of have those as well now, sadly, but if
Yeah.
you're Jummah Muslim, that's much less common. That isn't as acceptable. I think Sharia wise, it's definitely not, but in Christianity, I feel like it's seen as acceptable. Like you get your sins are washed away or something like that.
Mhm. And even like there are these Christian understandings that like faith is dead without works, but
Hmm.
I feel like even conservative Christians complain about this, that they feel like there's this so-called war on Christianity because they feel like they're not able to express their faith and stuff. I
Yeah,
never
yeah.
I never
There's a
felt
bit of truth.
yeah, I never felt it was like oppressive. I just thought there was kind of like a dissonance in the way that a Christian conservative would say, "Oh, I was oppressed. I'm not allowed to, you
Hmm.
know, practice my religion publicly." And oftentimes they mean like pushing it on others. I feel like
Hmm.
Islamically we have the notion of la ikraha
Yeah,
fid din, like
that's
verse
true. Yeah,
256 of Surah Baqarah. Like there's no
there's no
compulsion in
compulsion in
religion.
religion. Yeah.
Like you don't push your religion on others, but
Hmm.
your religion informs the way you in your
Hmm.
dealings with
So
others.
that was there was a conflict between the way the mosque and the parents had introduced Islam to you, is it's something that's always present in your life, in your consciousness, and society had introduced it to you as something that was just the one day of the week, not in your normal life. But then there was another element that you mentioned earlier. You were saying something about how Islam was introduced to you by your parents, and how society.
Yeah.
Okay, so go
So
ahead.
so that was like an issue that society had with just religion in general.
Hmm.
And then and there's this idea amongst like very secular people also that if you believe in religion, you're dumb, and if
Oh,
you
yeah.
believe in Islam, you're like especially
And you're
dumb kind of.
especially dumb.
Yeah. So there's
Sam Harris type, yeah.
exactly. This is like the motto of the new atheist. Like religion is stupid, Islam is especially stupid.
Yeah.
And
But there was one thing you mentioned about how there's also a conflict where Islam was, how it's introduced by your parents in the mosque, but then in society, how Islam is viewed.
yeah, so Islam in the mosque and at home is, this good thing. It's this thing that's good for society. It's this thing that's good for you. And then when you go to school, at best, your classmates are like, Islam, what's that? Or like Muslims, what are
The
those? Like,
terrorists, yeah.
yeah. Or that's at best. And at worst, it's like, you follow the same religion as those dudes on TV. So it was like,
Exactly, yeah.
there was always this clash going around on with me where it was like, is my religion what my is Islam what my family says it is, what the people at my mosque say it is, or is it like what my friend like
Yeah.
Logan says it is?
Unfortunately, we see a lot of Muslims who have strained relationships with their family, their friends, their community who are Muslims, and they tend to believe the what is Islam? Is it what the Muslims say or the non-Muslims? They end up believing the non-Muslim narrative. You see many Muslims internalize this, whether they apostatize or not. Of course, ex-Muslims, but there are many people who are currently Muslims who have internalized that narrative. Will they say, I'm a Muslim, but I'm a moderate, but I'm peaceful, but I don't believe in terrorism, or I'm
Uh-huh.
not an extreme Muslim or something like that. It reminds me of I saw this tweet where this guy said, I pray 5 times a day and I fast and I don't drink. It says like me, and then it was like liberal Muslim. Okay, ISIS. Where it's
Yeah.
like people have come to this conclusion where it's like if I just couch my Islamicness in enough layers of cushioning, that society will accept me. But then at the same time, that requires throwing average mainstream Orthodox Muslims under the bus, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
And
So
there's this idea, even the word extremist. Like I feel like in the Muslim context, it's like, oh, you're okay with a moderate amount of Islam, but
yeah,
once you
but
get
not
too much
extreme. Yeah,
Islam, like that's when things get bad. But it
yeah,
like no one would say like the Ku Klux Klan,
we're
like
extremists. Yeah.
they're just moderate Christianity, and then too much Christianity leads to like, like
Yeah,
burning
they're not
crosses.
the. I'm the moderate Christian. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I mean, I grew up in this. I think every single Muslim American or any Muslim in the West, really, probably worse in some countries like France, grow up with these issues. But if there's any other thoughts you'd like to add to that whole thought, I mean, we can move on to a
yeah.
little bit later in your life.
So I had this issue for a while up until I want to say middle school. And then
Hmm.
when I was in middle school, I was in health class and there was this white kid. His name is Will, and he was
Hmm.
reading this book called The Autobiography of Malcolm X. And I had seen the movie before with my parents, but I when I saw that book, I was like, "Oh, I really want to read this." And I remember I was in 7th grade and it's a fairly thick book, and I
Was it
would
because he was Muslim or?
I remembered him being Muslim, and I always like had this kind of like pride in being Muslim. So that was part of it. But I also remembered that I just really liked the movie, and I wanted to read the book. And I remember I would stay up late into the night. Like my mom would like knock on the door and tell me to go to sleep because I would spend like 3 or 4 hours reading this book. And I want to say I
Wow,
read it in like the course of a week. And I was in like 7th grade at the time. And I remember
it's
at one point,
above your leaving reading level.
yeah, way above. And I remember my mom would knock on the door and tell me to go to sleep. So I would do this thing where I would turn the lights off,
The
and I didn't have a
classic.
phone or anything, and I would just
Oh
count to a
wow.
hundred. And then after counting to 100, I would turn my lights back on so I could keep reading this book. And then eventually I would get paranoid that my mom would realize that the lights were back on. So then I started reading with like the light in my closet on, and I would be like sitting in my closet. But it was a book that really spoke to me because Malcolm X was someone who was a practicing Muslim who his understanding of Islam was something that also informed the way that he engaged with people in society, where
Right.
it was on Islamic terms that his Malcolm X's idea of justice is couched in an Islamic
Understanding.
epistemic, an Islamic understanding. So that was something that really spoke to me. And Malcolm X was also someone that was widely respected in society. So when
Right.
I
Right.
when I saw Malcolm X, I said, I want to be someone like that. I want to be
Hmm.
someone who is a deeply engaged Muslim who is able to benefit society.
Right.
And
So
it
many.
also,
You go
yeah,
ahead.
and it also like helped me like understand a lot of these like insecurities. That Malcolm X was someone who's a practicing Muslim who's able to positively impact society. So
Wow.
I guess I had these examples of like my parents and like uncles and aunties in the communities who are like doctors and stuff, but they're kind of just like boring people.
Yeah, that's kind of. I was gonna say it's kind of boring.
Yeah.
So one thing is nowadays we have people to look up to from our generation, from our parents' generation. I mean, Muslims are becoming more and more prominent. I mean, maybe not their politics is the greatest, but you have people like Fareed Zakaria and Mehdi Hassan who are out there and they're eloquent and people look up to them in their mainstream, etc. I mean, there's so many people like that. And Abdullah Sayed, a Sayed in my context ran for governor. And so Muslims are getting props, but I mean, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago when Muslims were coming here, and even us growing up, we didn't have Abdullah Sayyids growing up. We would look up to people like Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. My Muslim role model, I mean, I don't think I have a role model, really a Muslim role model, so to speak now. But when that was in my head as a child, it was always Muhammad Ali, and it was not because I was named or I had the same name as him, but because he was a heavyweight in American culture, and Americans really loved him. And I feel like maybe that's the only reason people could pronounce my name. I don't know how Hamza was for you, but there was no one ever they don't pronounce it correctly and say Muhammad Ali, but they were familiar with the name because of him.
Uh-huh.
And I was really proud that I felt like I was walking in footsteps, that I wasn't new, even though I did face difficulties and things like that. That at least some subset of the population, when they heard my name, they'd say, "Hey, Muhammad Ali, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee." Now I fear that won't be the case in 10 years, whenever kids will start to forget who he was. But at least growing up.
Yeah. And I also think we, as sort of South Asian, Arab, like Muslims from what you would call the Orient, we
Mhm.
really owe a lot to African American
Definitely,
Muslims
yeah.
who have
They set the tradition up.
they paved the way for Islam in America. Like if you look at the most influential Muslims, Islam in America is very much an African American phenomenon, whether it be Malcolm
Yeah,
X, Muhammad Ali,
not
Imam
only by
Khomeini.
influence but by numbers as well. I did
Yeah,
not know this. I had, that speaks to the ignorance that we as Middle Eastern, South Asian, whatever immigrants have. We always see Islam as the reflection of us, because to us our Islamic experiences in our community. But when I saw I think Pew, or I don't know, the census, maybe someone posted something. It's like the majority of Muslims in America are African American, and the majority of them are converts. I would have never thought that. I mean, there are obviously there's African American and African mosques near me, but as far as a numbers basis, we're so isolated in our communities. I could never picture that. But go to cities like Philly, LA, New York. There's
yeah,
like 10% of Philly is Muslim, and they're all black. It's amazing.
yeah.
So
Everyone's
many of our
Muslim in Philly.
communities don't. We wouldn't even know that. I definitely wouldn't have known that if I didn't look into that. So
Yeah. And Islam is very much growing in African American communities. So it's something that
yeah, yeah,
we as Muslims who immigrated here, we have to really support these people, and we have to understand that they've been in the United States as long as white people have been in the United States.
yeah,
They were
yeah.
brought here on slave ships. And
And some of them brought as Muslims.
as
The
Muslims,
earliest, the earliest writing we have about the American slave experience was by a Muslim guy. But let me bring up one last point about this, and let's go back a little bit to you, because I don't want to get too sidetracked. But what was beautiful
uh-huh.
to me, is interesting, was Islamic lingo is becoming mainstream African American lingo now. Saying Allah is normal. Like, I see rappers say Subhanallah, or thanks to all praise due to the Most High, and I'm like, wait, is this guy a Muslim? And the internet is like, no, he's like doesn't identify with the faith. But just like in the sense that any American would make a reference to Jesus or something like peace be upon him. That's becoming normal in the African American community. I think that's amazing, and it speaks to how familiar the Islamic tradition is. They wouldn't be using a word that's foreign to them. That's
Hmm.
very near and dear to them, and I think that's so beautiful. And again, so many of us Muslims from the Middle East, whatever, South Asia, North Africa, Eastern Europe, Turkey, we don't have that, that understanding sometimes, and I think
Uh-huh.
that's unfortunate. Even me, I've been ignorant. I met an African American guy. I was just standing, I don't know, late fleeting for something, and I was wearing a thobe, and this guy walked up to me, and he was like, "Inshallah, brother, that thobe is a form of dawah in of itself." And I was like, "Oh wow!" Like, and we started talking. I was like, "Did you convert?" And he's like, "No, my name's like Abdul Hakim. Like, I'm Muslim." I'm like, "Oh, are your parents immigrants?" And he was like, "No, they're from Detroit." And I was like, "Oh, really? Like, so like, did they convert?" And he's like, "No, bro, they were born Muslims. Like, my grandparents converted in the '60s." And I
Yeah,
was like, "Whoa, man! Like, I just assumed, oh, of course he's a convert, but he's third generation deep. All he knows is Islam and his parents." So yeah, man, we could talk about this for an episode, but I want to talk more about you. So let's go back. So you read Malcolm X, and you said that gave you an example of someone whose Islamic identity impacted him as an American, also informed his conception of justice.
mhm.
So do you want to talk more about that, or do you want to move, because there's another point you brought up about high
Yeah.
school? Do you want to move on to high school?
So then I guess Malcolm X also like speaks to how I was in school growing up. Like one thing that I really took from the autobiography of Malcolm X was his sincerity. Not only was he sincere, but when he believed something, he believed it with his chest. So
Hmm.
for 12 years, Malcolm X spends time with the Nation of Islam, and
Yeah.
he becomes Elijah Muhammad is technically head of the organization,
Hmm.
but Malcolm X is the actual person who is making the organization
So the
happen,
de facto
the de
leader.
facto leader. When Malcolm X comes in, the Nation of Islam has between 200 and 400 members, and when
Really?
he leaves the Nation of Islam, it has 25,000 members.
I did not
So
know that.
yeah, so people often say Elijah Muhammad made Malcolm X. The reality is Malcolm X made Elijah Muhammad, and he made that organization. And Malcolm
Wow, I
X
didn't know that.
sincerely believes that Elijah Muhammad is a messenger sent from God to give him the truth, right? And
Yeah.
then Malcolm X, in the autobiography, he talks about how he found out that Elijah Muhammad was having extramarital affairs, and this hurt Malcolm X so much that
Wow.
he believed this man is a messenger sent from God, and this man is going around sleeping around with women, violating the rules of the Nation of Islam, which is most definitely not what messengers from God do.
Yeah, right,
And
right.
Malcolm X, at this point, he's getting calls from the New York Times, he's getting invited to the Oxford Union, and all of this sort of
Yeah.
stuff. And at the heat of all of this, he decides to walk away from the organization. He walks away from
Wow.
all of this power and all of this stuff that he has, and he goes on Hajj,
Mashallah.
and he, travels around Africa, around the Muslim world. And when he comes back to the United States, he says, "I'm a dead man already." And he says, because he spoke out against the nation of Islam, he says members of the NOI want me dead, and the various organizations in the U.S. government want me dead. So he
Yeah,
says,
yeah.
between these two people, I'm a dead man already.
I
But
didn't
he
know that
comes,
actually. That's
yeah,
incredible.
and he comes back to the United States and he establishes Muslim Mosque Inc. and he establishes the Organization for African American Unity. And
I didn't know that part. Wow.
yeah, and when he establishes Muslim Mosque Inc., that's a purely religious organization for Muslims, and then he establishes the Organization of African American Unity. That's an organization for all people, for all Black people, and that's a political organization.
Wow, I
Because
didn't
he
know
said,
that.
oftentimes you can convince people to fight for their rights, you can convince people to do all of these sorts of things, but he says religion is sometimes very hard to convince people of.
That's very
And he's
true.
like, these people that I can't convince of religion, I still want them working for a better world because that's in line
Wow.
with his Islamic ethos. But Malcolm X, he lives for 10 months after that, and then
Only
he
10
dies.
months.
Only
Wow.
10
And then he
months.
gets assassinated.
Yeah.
It's
And
rumored that his assassin died, I think, a couple years ago. But I mean, who knows for sure who it was? But
yeah,
some. Yeah.
and his all the people who pulled the triggers were members of the Nation of Islam. And I think
Wow.
that speaks to the sincerity of Malcolm X. If he wanted
Is
to,
that known or is that a theory?
it's a fact that the three people convicted were members of the NOI, and two of them have confessed to the crime, and
Really?
one of them, and the two of them say they don't know who the third guy was.
I
And
think the
then,
third guy, they say he died recently
yeah,
because
the
someone
third
on
guy
my
died.
Facebook said I didn't even he had seen him in like a New York City masjid that he
Yeah,
recognized him.
and the interesting thing is, all three of these guys ended up becoming Sunni Muslims later.
Yeah, so he had become a Sunni Muslim and like, repented for his
Yeah.
action.
But just the sincerity of Malcolm X, he could have just stayed with the NOI and kept teaching that stuff and not told anyone what Elijah Muhammad was up to, and he
And
could
just
have
for the
kept
power,
all of
he
his
probably
power.
could have inherited something.
Yeah, but he literally chose to risk his life, and ultimately he died because he wanted to help teach people the truth and do the right thing. And that's a lesson that I always hope to have in my life. That believe everything that I believed, firmly and with my chest. But so Malcolm X, he says, the white man is the devil. He believes that firmly and with his chest. And then after a while, he says, oh, I was wrong. And he believes that firmly and with his chest.
Wow.
So we need to have sincerity and the ability to be wrong while understanding our past mistakes, and just work hard in the moment to always do the right thing.
He has a title that's in Urdu and Persian, Shahbaz. It means falcon, I think.
Yeah, Shabazz.
Means falcon. Yeah, I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
So then you move on. That was in middle school. So tell us about high school. There's also another point that you brought up about your high school.
So in high school, so we end up moving to New Jersey for my final year of high school.
There's a big
And
Muslim community there, right?
huge Muslim community. And where we lived in Maryland, so I live in Maryland from when I'm 10 to when I'm 16. And
Was that
where we
near
live
DC?
near DC, but like an hour out. So the Muslim community isn't all that big. Like there are some Muslim families. It's not like there are no Muslims, but there aren't that many. But when
Hmm.
we moved to New Jersey, everybody's Muslim in New Jersey. It's like 10% of my school is Muslim.
Rami lives there, right?
Yeah, so me and Rami actually have many mutual friends.
No, you're kidding.
Yeah, and me and Rami had the same Arabic professor in undergrad.
Can you get him on this program?
I'll try to get Rami on.
That's incredible. Okay.
But and we both had an amazing Arabic professor,
Really?
Muhammad Al Sayadi.
So he lied. He does know Arabic. In the show, he says he doesn't know any Arabic.
I mean, we took like elementary Arabic. I'm sure he knows how to introduce himself. New Jersey, there's a mosque right next to my house, and
Yeah.
then there's another one that's 10 minutes away.
Oh,
And that
so wow. Okay. It's a
Yeah,
Muslim
and that one
community.
10 minutes away, there's this one imam there who's just an extraordinary speaker,
Hmm.
and his name is Dr. Shadi Al Masri. I'm
Oh,
sure
really? Yeah,
you
he's
know
he's
that.
well known. I've seen him on social media a lot.
Yeah, so I show up to that masjid, and he gives great talks, but I never want to talk to him after Jummah or anything because I'm like this like shy kid, and I'm like, oh, he's so smart, he's so articulate. Like, what would I even talk to him about?
Right.
So he never notices this, but I almost like actively avoid him. Or when I do see him, I say like salam, and I'll be like, how are you? And don't make much conversation. And then Ramadan comes, and when Ramadan comes, people are praying Tarawih, but like I was more of like loiter in the parking lot type than like pray Tarawih type, right? So I'm just, chilling in the parking lot with my friends, and Dr. Sadly comes up to me and he hands me this book called The Instruction of the Student by
Really?
Imam al-Zurnuji al-Hanafi, which is a book, I think it's published in the 11th century, and it's about how to learn, like the method of learning, and how,
Was it was it because you were loitering, or he was just handing it out to the shabab?
I don't know. I don't think he handed out this book to everyone, but he
So
handed
he
it.
saw you loitering in the masjid, in the mosque parking lot during Taraweeh, and he was like, "This guy has potential. Let me set him on the straight path."
Yeah, so he gives me this book. It's a very, very small book. It's like 60 pages, and it's about the manners with which one should conduct themselves as a student. And I'm reading this book, and I'm just amazed by just the little things of how one should conduct themselves. Like one of the things that the book talks about is when you meet your teacher, it's bad manners to not ask any questions because then he'll think that you're disinterested. But it's also bad manners to ask too many questions because then you're kind of like pestering the teacher. And it says that a student that's too modest won't succeed because they'll be too shy, or too shy won't succeed because they're too shy
Hmm.
to ask any questions.
Like
But a
you
student
were.
that constantly like is too eager also won't succeed. So you got to balance between these two things, and it's just little stuff like that. And I read this book the summer after my senior year, and I take it into my freshman year of college, and I use a lot of those lessons in the university setting, and I end up doing really well in college. And I think
Well,
that
so
book has
tell us
carved.
where you went and what your major was. Give us a little bit of background on that.
So I did a year at Rutgers where I didn't really know what I was doing, and but what that book did, it gave me a love for the like classical Islamic tradition, and
Hmm.
it showed me that there was something there that I need to start learning.
That's
So
great.
my freshman year, I decided to sign up for Arabic, and then Dr. Shali gives me this zikr to do. That's like the ratib of Imam Khattab. And it's like, it takes 10 minutes a day. It's just like basic prophetic du'as in the morning and the evening. And
Hmm.
I'm just striving to do more beyond my daily prayers. And at Rutgers, there's a really, really nice Muslim community, and I benefit from a lot of the older guys. They,
Nice.
they just pray together. They teach me little things on the bus, that sort of, or on the like ride home, on the train, that sort of stuff. And then my freshman year of college, I decided to go to Qasid for a summer because I really
And
want to
that's
get
in
my.
that's in Jordan where we met.
Yeah,
But not this is not the time we met. We met later, but go ahead.
yeah. So I go to Qasid, and one of my friends from New Jersey, his
Hmm.
name is Hassan Osmani. He tells me that instead of going to Qasid, he's like, you should use your time in Jordan to hang out with this guy named Sheikh Nu Keller. And I have never heard of this guy. I do a Google search. I go to Google Images. I can't even find a picture of this
There's
guy.
no photos,
There's
yeah.
no photos. So I'm like, who is this random man? And then when I show up to my first orientation at Qasid, not the one that we met, but the one the summer
Mm.
after my freshman year, I meet this guy who works at Qasid. And I ask him, I say, have you heard of this man named New Keller? One of my friends told me about him. And he goes, yeah. He's like, if you want to know about him, I'm actually a murid of his. And,
Yeah.
I can get you in touch. And so Sheikh Nu he's a sheikh in the Shadali Sufi order, and a murid is like a disciple of his. Like you could say, like a
I've
student,
seen it translated as aspirant.
an aspirant.
Islam has a knack for pulling out weird English words that the English of themselves have forgotten, like prostrate, ablution, aspirant, these weird
Yeah,
words that are Arabic equivalents. But aspirant, murid, yeah, means
aspirant.
from orid, orad, follower.
One who wants. Yeah.
Yeah, one who wants, literally. So
So it's like
your
the sheikh has marifa. The sheikh has realized God,
knowledge, he has
and
knowledge, yeah.
the murid, his disciple, his student, wants to have what the sheikh has. So the sheikh, shows him the path to God, and then when he gets there, the sheikh says, "Now you're the sheikh, and you're going to
Yeah.
show other people the path to
I
God."
think the analogy that is most likely to resonate with people who aren't familiar with Sufism, maybe they're familiar with Rumi and Shams Tabrizi. So Shams Tabrizi was the sheikh and Rumi was the aspirant or the murid before he became a sheikh himself. So
Yeah, so I basically want to meet Shams, and I run into Rumi, who works at
yeah.
Qasid. So so he asked me, he's like, he says, "Have you ever done a hadra?" And for some reason, my Arabic's not as good at that time, so
Mhm.
I'm thinking hijama in my head, and I look at him and I go, "Cupping," and he goes, "Just come, I'll show you." And then I spend my that summer just engrossed in that community. I go to the lectures of Sheikh Nu. I go to the hadras, the dhikr circles that they have, and
So
I
a
spend.
hadra is when Sufis gather, and it varies by order to order, but generally it includes some sort of poetry, sometimes drums, flute, other maybe oud, and some dancing. Usually it varies,
Yeah,
but generally most people have seen this whirling dervishes of Turkey. That's actually not a great example. Most hadras are kind of circles with a lot of back and forth or
a lot
side
of
to
back and
side
forth. Yeah, just
and
like
chanting and
that.
things like that. It's like an experience where the idea is that God isn't just in books or in prayer, but you feel the prayer. That's what hadra actually means. It comes from hadara, like hadar
Presence.
being present.
Yeah.
We say hadrat sheikh, something like that. Hadra means presence. So you kind of feel the divine presence in the. But anyway, go ahead. So you
So
spend your
I
time in Gulf in that traditional Islamic environment.
yeah, and this is the first time I'd ever seen an environment like that.
Because
And
it's different when you grow up in the West. You go to the mosque, you go home, that's it. But being in a Muslim country where you hear the adhan, you're walking down the street, you hear it, see people wearing thobes, you see abayas, scarves, niqabs. You're in that. You're it's almost like a sea that you're drowning in.
yeah,
And you're just there's so much versus here we look for drops. There you're in a sea.
and then
So
I started studying Maliki fiqh with this guy who lives in Sheikh Noor's community. And the fiqh that I'm studying, I'm just learning the fiqh of prayer. It's very,
like
very
the most
basic stuff.
basic stuff, yeah.
But I see him teaching other students who are more advanced. And I remember he would always give us tea and he would always give us sweets. And
Hmm.
I'm just really moved by the character of the guy who teaches me.
Hmm.
And he's just so smart. Like he had studied philosophy in undergrad. He was an American who had lived in Jordan for over 10 years. His Arabic was on point and he knew these texts so well. He had most of them memorized. So
Wow.
when I see him, I'm just like I want to be like that guy. Like
Yeah.
he's someone I want to be like. So after that summer, I'm actually really sad to leave Jordan.
Yeah,
And
that's the way I felt when I left as
yeah,
well.
I remember the last thing I did in Jordan. I want to say my plane was at like 10 a.m. So I walk over to what was then Masjid Noor, where Sheikh
Hmm.
Noor prays, and I go there. I pray Fajr in his community, and then I go to his zawiya afterwards, and people are doing their daily dhikr after
Their
Fajr.
word.
Yeah, and I don't have a word at that point, so I'm just doing the prophetic dhikrs and stuff like that. And then I leave, and I'm just so sad, and I think to myself like when I get back, I'm gonna just go back to college. Work a sort of I'm gonna work towards getting a job, work a 9 to 5, and I say, what will that do? Like I wish I could do more. And
Right, I
I
felt the same way. Yeah.
yeah, and I I don't know if I actually cry on the like ride back, but I'm just so sad to leave Jordan.
Yeah.
And
I
then
find, go ahead.
yeah, no, you go.
So a couple of things, I find that these experiences are really important going to a Muslim country, because a lot of times people have this halfway experience in the diaspora versus when you're engulfed. Of course, God is everywhere and Islam is in our hearts, but at the same time, when you feel it with other people, it's different. And another thing is, I think it's amazing going from, the American university system, the Western system, where you're at a big hall, the professor walks in, he rushes in, he teaches his lecture, he rushes out. You don't know who he is. You don't know who the left and right of you are, or behind and front. You're just trying to get the grade versus, and you're stressed to get there on time, etc. Versus in the East, like you said, you go to the guy's house and you sit on his couch and he gives you tea and you laugh and you have some jokes, and then he opens a text and you're friends and you feel this personal connection where, you become best friends with your teacher. Versus, in the West, so many, especially in a big university like the one I went to, the one you go to, I guess you still go to it, although it's online.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
A lot of times, unless you're in a really specified class, you sit down, take some notes, get the grade, leave. How many professors do you think you really get to know, unless you try?
Yeah.
Versus in the Islamic system, try or don't try, you're gonna get to know them really well because you're sitting
Yeah.
right in front of each other. So
And we would sit on the floor like knee to knee.
yeah,
And
exactly.
it's
That's
like
what
really
the
beautiful
Sunnah
moment.
way. Yeah, it's so beautiful and intimate. It's amazing here, and of course the reasons are valid because sexual assault is a big issue. But whatever the reason be, the culture of this distance between the professor and a student. Oh, you can't get their number; it's inappropriate. You can't go alone. You can't meet them outside of class. You can't go to their house. You can't. And again, I understand. I'm not a woman that's in place for that reason. But regardless, the fact that that culture is there, it's very distant
Hmm.
versus in the Muslim world, there's none of that. You're in their house, you're staying on their couch, you spend the night. If you study, after Isha, you could sleep and wake up for Fajr and then leave in the morning. And
Yeah.
the boundaries are there, so there's you. Inshallah, nothing happens. But uh, it's just such a close relationship, and it almost feels like it's an insult to education to call what we have in universities here, especially large universities, education. It's not. It's just cramming.
There's also this difference between information and mentorship.
That's
Like
very
I
true.
feel
Yeah.
like the teachers that I had overseas, they really gave me mentorship. They taught me how to be a person. I
Yeah.
don't really even remember most of the information they taught me. It was so long.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
But
Yeah.
the character that I felt, the what we call is like the nur that I felt through them, the light that I felt through them, which is ultimately a reflection of the light of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam,
So,
because these
so
people had they had studied under people who
it's
studied
a
under
chain.
people who
Yeah.
studied
It's
under
a
people
chain.
who studied from the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Like
So
they
it's a
had the
silsila in Islam. Is it's a
yeah.
chain in Arabic from the Prophet peace be upon him to the present sheikh, teacher, whoever. It's a continue. And the Jewish tradition has a similar idea as well. I don't think it's present anymore in the Christian tradition,
Mhm.
but I think it's amazing. You're right. It's beautiful. You're not just there to learn information. You're absorbing the character. It's almost like the Socratic way, the way the Greeks used to do it as well. You know, you're
Mhm.
there. You're learning from them as a whole, their character, their everything, not just what's in the book. It almost seems like the book can be secondary sometimes.
Yeah.
So
There's
that's beautiful.
Sheikh Ibrahim Niasse has a quote where he says he was a really great Senegalese Islamic scholar. He says that knowledge is not found between the two pieces of leather. Like knowledge is not found in books. And he says rather knowledge is found between the hearts of men.
Yeah, that's exactly what was said. So I was in a zawi that I attended in Amman, and one of the shuyukh there was saying we had these guys coming from Chechnya, who were students of Qasid or something, and they came and they're like, let's sit down and let's work through this book and that book and this book and that book. And it seemed like they were just really focused on cramming in a lot of books while they were there. Because, to become certified, getting a jaza, you need this book, that book. It's like a checklist. And the
Uh-huh.
guy was saying, look, man, the ma'rifah, the knowledge, it's not in the books. The books are secondary. It's in the connection. The sheikh will teach you. Just forget the books. Like, yeah, you read the books, of course, but
Yeah.
don't focus on the book. Don't come in with like an Excel spreadsheet of the books you need ticked off. That's not the point. These books didn't exist during the Prophet's times, peace be upon him. We created these, so relax. I mean, of course they're important. The tradition is important, but also, the human element is the most important. The sir, the secret, what's transferred from, peer to murid. It's that human connection. So
Mhm.
so you go back, you finish Glasgow, you go back to America. Then what do? You go to undergrad.
Yeah, so at that point I had transferred universities also. So I go to Vanderbilt, which is in Nashville, Tennessee,
Oh my
and
God.
my
Back
plan
in the south.
is that I'm majoring in math and economics. But after this experience, I could never do that. And
Hmm.
I show up. I decide to take Arabic. I want to keep my Arabic going, and I
Hmm.
take Arabic with this professor who is actually one of the best Hadith scholars of our time.
Really?
He had actually studied under Sheikh Abdurrahman al-Shuguri, who was
No way.
Sheikh. So he was also someone who he would tell me things, and I would understand what he was telling me years later after thinking about what he said for a day, every
Wow.
day for the next 2 years. And he was someone with immense wisdom. And then I took this other class called Islam in South Asia, and I kind of just took it thinking, I'm Muslim, I'm South Asian, I know about Islam in South Asia, like it'll be
Yeah.
easy. But the professor who taught the class, he actually, to my knowledge, he's not Muslim, but he is someone who is an anthropologist of religion and a really good historian of religion. So I take this class with him, and I'm just blown away by the history of Islam in the subcontinent, how it came to the
Wow.
subcontinent, all these issues that arose, how people gradually became Muslims slowly and slowly. And I just think to myself after this class, I want to do this for the rest of my life. I could spend my entire life just engrossed in figuring out these sorts of things. And oftentimes people complain about kind of the Western study of religion, like the idea of studying religion in a Western academy. But I want to say that 90% of the time, I've actually found it to be a really good experience.
Really?
And I think that oftentimes people who study traditionally, they actually miss out on some of these aspects, like the idea of studying religion from an anthropological perspective, where you study a community and you are not making any truth judgments, but you're sort of just studying the community,
Hmm.
how they interact. And then I'm introduced to sort of critiques of secularism, which I had
Okay.
been grappling with since I was very young. And
Really?
finally, I'm given the language on why these things are an issue. And
Was
I
in that
realized,
same class, the critique
yeah,
of secularism? Okay.
and I realized that like religion is like this Western Protestant category that showed up in the 1700s. So obviously, as a Muslim trying to follow this living tradition that has an unbroken chain back to the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, obviously I'm going to have trouble
Hmm.
pasting that into this 17th
Right,
century
right.
thing that has its own like unique European heritage
Exactly. You're totally right. Yeah,
within
it's
Protestant
different.
denominations. So I actually found it to be very helpful, sort of in that sense.
Really? So
Yeah.
I have my own criticisms about how Western academia approaches Islam, more from a theological perspective. I think, of course, studying history, if the material our professor is an Orientalist history is history, or studying communities, like you said, my issue it tends to be that the fiqh tends to be taken non-seriously because I think the baseline assumption in Western academia is relativist. What we see is what we get as far as tangibility. And I think Sheikh Hamza Yusuf actually really brought this up well. He says in Arabic, haq, truth, is another word for God. Truth, God, they're the same. So our idea of truth is a metaphysical, but he was saying in Latin, which is of the base of Western civilization, res means thing and it means truth as well. So to them, a thing is the truth. What you feel is our
Uh-huh.
physical realm. So sometimes I feel like that's a base assumption, but on a large level, but on the small level in university studying religion, sometimes I feel like they're like, okay, so this is what they believe over there, but we're just looking at it as a fact, not we're
Yeah.
actually versus in a Muslim institution, you're actually taking it as what you genuinely believe in. It's totally different. But I like to hear your thoughts. Do you find that maybe your context was different, or can you maybe elaborate or rebut that?
For the most part, it does lack that sort of metaphysical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So implicitly, some would say that implicitly there's an idea that the metaphysical perspective just isn't there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also there's this idea, I would just think of it in my mind as we're not sort of engaging these sort of metaphysical questions. And oftentimes I would think to myself, like, if my professors were to like engage these metaphysical questions, they would just be Muslims. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
so if someone doesn't believe that the Quran is the word of God, then they can study Islamic history in these sorts of ways.
Mm-hmm.
They can study Muslim communities in these sorts of ways. They
Right.
can critique modern Western civilization in these sorts of ways. But they're
Mm-hmm.
not going to tell me how to pray my 4 rakahs for Zohar.
Okay.
They're not going to tell me how to wash my hands and make wudu before I pray, right?
Right.
And I just understood this as sort of out of the lane of those that I was studying under.
Okay, interesting. One thing, because I bring that up, I read Yasser Ghadna. I watched a speech he had about for an hour about how his experience in Yale was totally life altering, where he spent 10 years in Medina. He was very much a part of, I guess you could say, the Salafi school. I mean, it's a self-identified Salafi community there. And then when he
Yeah.
went to Yale for, I don't know if a second PhD or a PhD, he realized that his understanding of Islam was wrong, and that he's like said Azhar is a building that we've built, and you realize when you study Islam from a non-traditional point of view, it's almost like the wrecking ball breaks the building down. Again, not saying that he's apostatized or anything, but
Uh
that
huh.
if you step outside the Islamic tradition, you realize some of this stuff is what we've invented, is not necessarily there in the religion. Not to call Azhar bid'ah or anything, but
Yeah.
I guess maybe his idea of our scholarship, it's not like scholarship isn't, it's something we've created at the end of the day. We've written every book, other than the hadith and the Quran, but we wrote all those books. And then I remember seeing Numan Ali Khan giving a speech saying, so many of these kids go to the West to study Islam and they apostatize, where they go and they look at the religion from a secular framework. And, once it's in that secular framework, it's like next to physics and whatever and history and all that, then you kind of start to view it as just a subject, and then you lose your iman. And I've personally seen this. A lot of kids go to university and they lose their iman there. Where I had the opposite. I gained it there, but
Yeah.
people go and they study Islam, and I talk to kids all the time, and they know me as someone who's engaged with Islam. They ask me questions, they bring up these doubts, and also someone who's publicly said I used to just not even believe in it when I went through the doubts. So they feel comfortable asking me, and they say, we're learning in class that Muhammad, peace be upon him, he had a wife that was this year old, or they had this many battles, or they did that, they did that, they did that, and they're facing all these things being challenged in a secular framework, and they're not equipped with the, not to say that they're not smart enough or something, but they're not equipped with just the knowledge or the rebuttals or the Islamic point of view or the Islamic context. They're raised in the West, and they're just faced with this. They don't know what to make of it, so they say, "Khalas, I'm done. I left Islam." And I see this so much. It's so, which is why, I mean, I'm not going to discourage studying. We should always study more, but I feel like you need to be in the right mindset to approach Islam from a secular framework. Because if you go in their framework, I say there as far as the secular, smart Muslim or whatever other religion,
Yeah.
you're gonna lose if you're not ready, because
I
you're on
think.
you're on their terms. You're not in Azhar or in
Yeah.
Jordan or Saudi or Iran or Iraq. you're in their field. So,
I think the first thing that you need some base Islamic education.
hmm
And if you don't have that, you need access to people who do. So you need to be friends with people who are learned. Like my
hmm
Arabic professor at Vanderbilt was one of the most learned Islamic scholars on hadith in the world. So he was someone who, if I ever had a question about anything that was said in class, I could go to him, and I really enjoyed going to him. So
hmm
I would go to him probably more times than I needed to because he was such a good resource to have. I would text Dr. Shadi Al Masri every now and then if I had a
hmm
question. And there's also this really, really good video on YouTube. It's called Advice to Muslim College Students from Jonathan Brown. And
hmm
one thing he talks about is that we as Muslims really need to be aware of the assumptions underlying um, a lot of ideologies. And ideology, he says, is something that is kind of the background of people's brains, and it's things that they they say they believe that do without realizing that they
Yeah,
believe
the
that thing.
fund, the paradigm they're in.
Yeah.
Our paradigm is secular and against Islam for the most part in the West
Uh-huh.
here.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I wouldn't say it's against Islam, but I would say that there are definitely parts that don't align with an Islamic worldview.
The thought of nasib qadar,
Mhm.
inshallah, mashallah, our view of how the universe works, jinns, things like that, otherworldly things, the unseen. I mean,
Yeah.
all these things are the main issues. Again, a lot of the things that cause kids to apostatize are issues like this, where they can't reconcile this Protestant work ethic with the idea of rizq, or
Mhm.
they can't reconcile the idea of free will with uh, fate. They can't reconcile the idea of your death is decided for you with what should XYZ, I should do this, some things like that. So a lot of times it just which one do you pick? Do you pick the outdated, you know, look down upon older worldview, or do you pick the one that society subscribes to? You pick the one that society subscribes to.
Or I think even like just a little thing that goes on in college. You know,
hmm
you make some friends. You're chilling at a restaurant, and they order food,
Yeah,
and
what do
then
you do?
one of the friends says, you know, I'm gonna get wine for everyone at the table. And
hmm
how do you explain? You tell them, oh no, I don't drink. It's not allowed in my religion. And then they say to you, what's the issue? You're not harming anyone. And the
Yeah,
idea
the
that you can do
secular.
whatever you want as long as you don't harm anyone, this is
hmm
secular liberalism. But
Yeah.
in an Islamic worldview, we believe that our body doesn't belong to us, but it's a gift
hmm
from God, and that
Yeah.
we are to treat our bodies how God says they're commanded.
Yeah.
And
It's yeah.
in the liberal worldview, freedom is doing whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anyone. But in
Right.
Islamic worldview, if you just do whatever you desire, you're not actually free, but you're a slave to your nafs. You're a slave to your lower
Right.
self.
Right.
You're a slave to your carnal desires. You're a slave to like what Freud calls the Freudian id, right?
hmm
So the way that you're free is that you go above these desires. You're not a slave to alcohol and food and sex and all these sorts of
You
things.
don't need those things. Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't need those things. And if someone is goes into college not aware of that, if they're not aware of the assumptions and these various ideologies, they're going to have a really,
Right.
really hard
Right.
time functioning as a Muslim.
So one of the biggest issues that not issues, I think differences of how we conceive of morality and things like that was how we understand what's acceptable to do and where. So when I studied abroad in Jordan, a lot of the people I knew were people like you and I, Muslims, studying abroad mostly for the reasons of culture, religion, things like that. We want to understand the Quran and Hadith and Qasidas and stuff. And then
Uh-huh.
a lot of times you get these white kids who want to be in the FBI or in the army or work in a think tank. So they're not Muslim, they're Christian, or maybe they're no religion at all. Who knows? It's not really important, but they're not Muslim is the important part. And they would say, okay, let's go do X haram thing, right? Whatever that be.
Uh-huh.
And then I'll be like, no, dude, I'm good. And they're like, but you do that at home, right? Let's say like drinking wine. Let's say Persians drink wine, right? That's just very common. It's all over the poetry. Everyone's we invented wine, right? The earliest wine was found in Mesopotamia where Persians were, right? So then they'll say, let's go drink. And I say, well, no, I wouldn't do that in public. And they say, well, what's the difference? Are you a hypocrite or something? And I said, no, the difference is that we know it's wrong according to our religion. We acknowledge that it's wrong, right? But
Mhm.
we don't do it in public because that's an implicit encouraging of it. So we do it in private because we believe that sinning it's bad, but it's better to sin in private and then not talk about it. So if
Mhm.
you do zina, if you drink, everyone sins, of course, but we don't express it in public because that's an implicit way of saying it's okay. Versus if you do it at home and only at home, you know that it's wrong, and that's showing that you know it's wrong. And you're also not, because group encouragement is a thing. If you walk
Mhm.
into a room and everyone's drinking, call us, I'll drink too. But if you
Uh-huh.
walk in a room and no one's drinking, you don't want to be the first person to do it.
Yeah.
So, but this idea didn't make any sense to them. You're not encouraging anything. It's just you're independent. But to us, we're all parts of a community. We all influence each other. So there's this different view on this individual versus
Mhm.
community based view. And then we say, it's like haram to talk about people's sins. It's haram to talk about your own sins, just as haram it is to do the thing. There's this famous hadith, I think, by Sayyidina Ali. He said, don't, if you see your, if like, I think it was something like, if on the way home from Isha, you see someone sinning, what would someone be doing, at 10 p.m. drinking, womanizing something? Don't don't spread judgment the next morning, because he may have cried praying Fajr and asked for and repented during that time. So
Yeah.
you never know, right? So there are a lot of these worldviews are different, and it's kind of hard to explain sometimes.
Yeah.
But
There's
anyway,
a
that was
quote.
a good example.
Yeah. There's a quote from Imam Jafar as-Sadiq where he says that if you see, make 70 excuses for
Your
your
brother, yeah.
brother, and he says if you can't do it,
Mhm.
then the issue is not with them, but the issue is with you.
So there's another one where it says, I don't know if it was the prophetic hadith or one of the imams or scholars. Maybe it was Imam Abu Hanifa. I don't quite remember. I wish I could pull this up. But the quote was, if you smell alcohol on your brother's beard, assume that someone tripped in the street and spilled it onto him, or
Uh-huh.
spilled it out of their roof, like their window or something. Like, just always make good. They say husna dhan in Arabic. Good thoughts. Just assume the best. Don't ever assume a sin, and don't talk about it. Because it creates this environment. We'd rather just not talk about it. So anyway, that's one of the things that's these views that's kind of confusing to Westerners, because Westerners again have the opposite conception, where people are always quick to expose themselves and say, oh, I lied, I'm sorry, and talk about their issues and talk about their troubled past, versus to us, don't talk about it.
Hmm.
Don't ask people about the past sins. That's actually haram, to inquisition someone about their past sins. You're not supposed to do that. Even some of our scholars say, if you've done zina before and you genuinely repent and you want to get married, you can just tell your partner that you can see you're Islamically a virgin, even though you're not biologically, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but even though you're not biologically, if we can say that, a virgin,
Yeah.
that's even like
I don't even know if virginity exists
yeah,
biologically.
but like the
Yeah.
idea or whatever, like you're not physically in the
Like you
sense of
haven't had illicit sex before, you would say.
yeah,
Yeah.
just for the sake of protecting people's dignity in society. So we have all these protections in place because we value honor so much.
Uh-huh. Yeah. We
So
really value it says in Surah Isra, Laqad karamna bani Adam.
yeah,
Surely
right.
we have honored the children of Adam. Each and every human being
hmm
has this sort of karama, this sort of dignity that they're assigned by virtue
hmm
of their humanity.
So you brought up this example that got us into this extra tangent about everyone orders wine, or maybe your friends want to order haram food, whatever, and you have to explain yourself. I feel like nowadays the bacon and wine and alcohol thing is pretty much everyone knows.
Hmm.
So you could just, I think you can get away with that now. Everyone knows that. But there's still other things like shaking hands, hugging,
Hmm.
other things that aren't as well known, because see, like every Muslim will say no to alcohol and pork in public usually. I mean, not every, but like at least pork you can assume they'll say no, right?
Hmm.
Versus a lot of Muslims do hug and shake hands, so even that now, it's still an issue that requires explaining and stuff like that.
Uh-huh. Yeah, but I feel like Muslims who are going into college, and especially those who are going to study Islamic studies, they really, really have to be aware of these different worldviews. And I feel like there's also this trend of, there are Muslims who they don't like liberalism, and then they think that the alternative to not liking liberalism is being like this
Salafism.
white nationalist. And it's like, no, there are a lot of things in Islam that actually correlate with liberal ideals, but you have to know where, if you're looking at it as a Venn diagram, you have to
hmm
know where the points diverge, and you
Yeah.
have to know where that commonality is.
hmm
And if you're not aware of the assumptions of other worldviews, you're going to have a really, really hard time studying Islamic studies in the academy. You're going to have a really, really hard time going to college as a practicing Muslim. And you're just going to have a really, really hard time functioning in this modern world that is
hmm
very, very pluralistic, where you see all of these different worldviews, people of different worldviews living together, and you see a lot of these worldviews converging. If you're
Right.
not aware of these things, you're going to have a really, really difficult
Yeah.
time.
So this is a new phenomenon. If you look historically in the Muslim world, I'm talking about a time where America wasn't the America we know. You look at Cairo, Jerusalem, Istanbul, Tehran, Delhi, any historical city in the Muslim, let's just say Muslim world,
Uh huh. The
you'll
so-called Muslim
see
world.
so-called Muslim world. You'll see so many cultures living together, but they literally lived in walled off cities. They like, and I mean, Jerusalem still has the walls. Cairo, I don't think has the walls. I think most of the walls got demolished by colonization. In Cairo, the Brits took away the walls, and I don't know if Istanbul ever had the walls. Maybe it was built differently, the architecture. But suffice to say, there was quarters in the different cities, and they more or less stuck to those quarters. So yeah, we had cosmopolitanism, but we weren't rubbing shoulders and befriending each other and marrying each other and interacting. We were off in our own zone. You know, in Tehran, you'll find the Armenian quarter. In Isfahan and Shiraz, there's quarters for these groups. But nowadays, you know, we're up in each other's faces. We're neighbors, classmates, best friends. You know,
Uh-huh.
we sit next to each other. So
I mean, I feel like there are examples of intermarriages in the past. There are examples of people of different religions studying in the same
mhm,
universities. So you do see those examples, but the idea of the quarters is very profound because it
mhm,
really shows that when you're in the Muslim or the Jewish quarter, you're not going to eat pork, right?
yeah,
But in the Christian quarter, according to the assumptions of their ideology, you are allowed to eat pork.
yeah,
So there is this understanding that you're able to, different worldviews are able to function together, and
right,
that's
yeah,
where I think Islam, the the example of Islamic civilizations of the past
right,
sets a precedent for this sort of pluralism and cosmopolitanism you see
right,
in like liberal ideology. One example that I love is Zoroastrians. I want to say it was in the time of the Abbasids. They
yeah.
used to practice incestful
I
marriages.
was gonna say the parent
Yeah,
marriage is the parent-child marriage.
where like mothers would marry their sons and stuff.
This is so a brief explanation before some Iranian in the comments accuses me of not defending Iranians. So this is a similar thought. So the Jews also have this thing. I think it's the Cohens or the Levites or the priest class, and they're supposed to marry either Cohen or a Levit, depending. I mean, I'm sure that there's modern Jewish people who don't care so much; they just want to marry a Jewish person. But traditionally speaking, this is the practice that occurred, and I think some still uphold this. The Zoroastrians have the same idea that the priestly class should only marry the priestly class. So this is where this practice of marrying within your family came. And of course, this doesn't happen anymore, but it happened historically. And the Muslim empires were struggling, figuring out how to handle this situation. But anyway, go ahead. I won't
Yeah. So
speak
so
in.
the Muslim empires, they would recognize these marriage contracts, and oftentimes when these guys had complaints, when the people within the marriage in this incestual marriage, when they had complaints,
I want to get a divorce, a mother-child
yeah,
divorce.
they would go to the Islamic court, and the Islamic court would handle their disputes. And the reason
Wow.
for this is that they understood that if in the assumptions of their worldview, it's perfectly normal for them to do what they're doing. We
Yeah.
disagree with their assumptions, but we understand these ideas of
We'll
pluralism.
respect their. So that's what I think is amazing, that in the Muslim world we had real pluralism in the sense that we'll accept you as you are. You know, the Armenians till this day in the Muslim world speak to one another in Armenian. Till this day they keep their traditions, their clothing, etc. Versus in the West we have this superficial idea of pluralism, but it's like, hey, you better dress like us, you better sound like us, eventually name your kids like us, eventually forget your language, you know, push your religion into a corner, you know. So we had real pluralism, and again, it lasts. The proof is in the pudding. We have communities in the Middle East, minority religious communities that are 1,000 years old, that speak the same language, have the same customs. Yeah, of course they face issues. No society is perfect, and a lot of times recently for various issues in post-colonial countries. But I
Uh,
mean, again, up until recent oppression, you look at the Copts in Egypt, the Armenians, sadly not in Turkey unfortunately, but in a lot of part, like
yeah.
in Iran, the Armenians, uh, you can just, again, the Jews in Iran up until very recently, in Iraq and in Yemen and Egypt, again, up until recently, we've had some bumps because of various issues. But, you know, looking at the grander picture, life as a minority of any kind was better in the Muslim world than in Europe, you know, where they had pogroms and expulsions. You know, when we lost Andalusia, the Jews fled to Morocco. They preferred life there
Uh,
under Muslim rule. And there I was reading, so Jewish synagogues have this khazana, we'd say in Arabic, this cache, I guess you could say, of documents. So when they'd have important documents, they just stash it in there as a record. I think it's beautiful. And one was discovered in Cairo, in Fustat, in historic Cairo, you know, what predated Cairo. And they found a new cache, and there was documents. And I was reading this paper that had compiled them and translated them, of specifically in cases of Jewish and Muslim interaction. And there was hilarious documents of two Jews would get into a dispute, and they would decide to. So they had parallel courts. They had their, you know, they say, oh, Sharia courts. They actually had Jewish courts in Muslim countries.
mhm.
But a lot of times it was interesting to see if they decide to go to the Muslim court instead of the
Yeah.
Jewish one. So there was one case where a guy went to the Jewish court, and the Jewish court I guess there was some wasta going on that maybe they didn't want to handle the case.
Some corruption, yeah.
Yeah, he took it to the Muslim court, and the Muslim court arrested the guy and took it to trial. Or
Mhm.
there were other cases where they would approach one court and realize that the other court would give them a more favorable option, like divorce, for example. Maybe historically in Jewish law, I don't know, maybe there was no divorce settlement. Or
Uh-huh.
where, oh, in Jewish law, the man has to give a get. It's called in Hebrew, which is the man has to approve the divorce. There's no talaq for women. Muslim law, talaq isn't necessarily as favorable as, let's say, secular law to women, but you have certain criterion where, like, if he's not satisfying you, if he's crazy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So like a Jewish woman would get her divorce registered in the Muslim court because the Muslim court would be willing to give her a divorce at all. So I think those are hilarious things that it seems unimaginable today, you know, considering the modern state of these countries. But we had really an example of pluralism, you know, 1,000 years before these guys started committing genocide. And, you know, now they look down on us saying, oh, look at these barbarians, you know, destroying each other.
Mhm. And I feel as though a lot of the oppression you see of minorities in Muslim majority countries today is because we as Muslims have forgotten that tradition of pluralism.
Right.
In 1492, when the Muslims and Jews are kicked out of Spain, the Ottoman Empire not only takes in Jewish refugees, but they say to the Catholic monarchs of Spain, the Ottoman Sultan says, "Thank you for enriching my empire at the
Wow.
expense of yours." So this is our
Incredible.
religious tradition. These are the scholars of our past that we follow and we embody. And what they were doing was only reflecting the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad SAW, someone
Wow.
who ruled and gave each and every single human being their
Mhm.
rights, regardless of their race or religion or any
Yeah.
of these sorts of things.
We have precedents for all this too. I mean, I remember there was a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ in Medina, the Jews were having a dispute amongst themselves, and they called him. He was the highest legislator to arbitrate, but he arbitrated them according to the Torah, and then the hadith clearly states. I think it's in Bukhari and Muslim, or maybe just one, where it's saying he put the Torah in his lap as he would do as. I think the Quran wasn't written at the time, but retrospectively, they're saying as we would treat the Quran. Yeah, and
Yeah.
he not dropping it on the ground or something. Like it's not a normal book, and he
Hmm.
treated it with care, and they interpreted it to him, and he judged according to that interpretation.
Hmm.
So it's not as we would think of now, where they're like, oh, they want to come impose Sharia law on all of us. We had this tradition, even till this day in Iran. Again, not defending Iran, not saying it's perfect. I have a lot of criticisms, but even the fact that there's some matters are allowed to be determined internally. You know, the Christians can have alcohol in Iran. The Jews handle their marriages the way they handle them and inheritance and all that. So we do have this tradition that's even alive till this day. Again, Iran's not a perfect country, not even close.
By far.
But the idea, just the thought
Yeah.
that it exists and it's even till this day in practice is incredible. This
Hmm.
idea of allowing legal traditions to exist, and I think that's the ultimate pluralism is not to mash everyone together, but to say no. You can exist and do your own thing, and society will respect you within your context, of course, but do as you will. So I think that we need to really learn from this tradition and bring it back and also be proud of it. So whenever people try to frame us as, you know, hateful, intolerant, whatever, we can say no. That's not the full truth.
Yeah, there are two really, really great books on this. The first is Introduction to Islamic Law by
Hmm.
Wa'il Halak, who's a professor at
Hmm.
Columbia. And the second is The Impossible State, in which Halak argues that the modern nation state has this whole European lineage that goes back to the monarchs of Europe that had very, very strong power. And he says Islamically, what happened was there was a sultan who was the ruler, but the ulama, the scholarly class, they didn't collaborate with the ruler, but
Yeah.
rather they existed independently of the ruler and provided moral critiques. So it's really, really important that we remember this legacy. And there's a beautiful story of Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba, who was famous West African Islam. The sheikh, the alim, the scholar who goes to hell is the one that is close to rulers. And he says the
Wow.
ruler that goes to heaven is the one that's close to
Close to the
scholars.
scholars. Wow.
And there once upon a time, there was the scholar who was advising the ruler wrote Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba a letter, and he said, we want you to advise, we want you to advise the ruler. We want you to be his kind of right-hand man." And Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba writes back a letter, and the scholar who advises the ruler says, "I don't know if you want me to read this to you. It's kind of insulting." And he says, "No, read it to me. Like, how insulting could it be?" And Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba says that a scholar advising a ruler, the scholar is like a bunch of flies, and the ruler is like a pile of feces. He's like, that's the relationship that the two of you have. And
Oh
then the
my
scholar
God.
says, I can't believe he compared me to a bunch of flies. Like, I'm this learned man. And the ruler
Right,
goes,
right.
don't you hear what he called me? He compared me to a pile of feces.
Right. Wow. That's incredible. I think that really speaks to the way we think about governance. Where I think in the West, the government's the ideal. Americans love, as much as they critique it, they're really proud of their government. And I think in the Middle East, it's the opposite. We always hate on our governments, regardless of how good they are. We're always complaining. We always think that government is, going to be tyrannical. It's going to be falling short of our ideals. I think that's where a lot of times, or this modern stance is kind of lost on American Muslims, but this is where the quietism of Islam really comes in.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that government is just going to be bad. It can only get so good, but it's always going to be flawed and awful and power hungry. So let the
Yeah.
ulama just do their thing and do dawah with the masses, and we'll focus on ourselves, and inshallah the society will improve. But we shouldn't. I feel like Americans believe too much in the system,
Mm-hmm.
right? They they're not critical enough. They say, I think Malcolm X said people always go. I'm paraphrasing, to go change a system from within, but it's really the system that changes them from within.
Yeah. And Ghazali, when he says stay away from sultans, part of the reason for this is back then people held scholars in very high regard. So if the scholar critiqued the ruler knew that to have the support of the people, he had to fall in line. But
Wow.
nowadays, rulers give scholars legitimacy because
Yeah,
people care
man.
more about politicians than they care about people who are learned in the religion. So it's really an issue of modern times, and I don't know how you resolve this, but the
Yeah.
quietism now often becomes like a means of legitimizing it. So
Yeah.
if, in the example of Egypt, if the government shoots peaceful protesters in the street, and
Hmm.
then the ulama say we're not going to say anything about it while
Yeah.
all of the Egyptian society is talking about it, then this is an issue. If the government is persecuting religious minorities, like we see in Pakistan, like we
Yeah.
see in Iran, if the government is persecuting religious minorities and the scholars don't say anything about it, or if they legitimize it, it's not going to work in our modern times. So it's just changing
Yeah.
power dynamics.
The ulama have lost all respect and support in almost everywhere.
Yeah.
The only example I can think of that's not the case, I would say, maybe Sayyid Ali Sistani in Iraq. He's pretty consistently spoken up against the government or whoever, and usually made good stances and has worked for the best, I think, in Iraqi society for the most part. But
Mhm.
other than that, I can't think of a scholar really anywhere in any part of the Muslim world who has a similar stature, following, and public perception as he does. I mean, recently Ahmad al-Tayyib, the Mufti of Azhar, made some really, lame, not lame, they were legitimate, but kind of weak, low-level criticisms of the Egyptian society, really, not even the government. And it was people were saying, oh my God, the precedent is broken. The Mufti of Azhar spoke against Sisi and things like that. He was just kind of talking about how Egyptian society had lost its connection to traditionalist Islam. But we've gotten to a point where the ulama are so useless as far as society is concerned that even saying something really, mild that everyone knows already, it's just considered like, wow, I don't know if you saw this, but it's like, wow, the Mufti of Azhar broke tradition and
Yeah.
criticized the government or
It's like you
something.
should be providing these independent
Yeah,
critiques.
yeah. And
This
not
is
to
why,
say, yeah,
yeah, this is why I love Sheikh Ibrahim Nayas. Sheikh Ibrahim Nayas was a Senegalese Islamic scholar who died in the year 1975, and he was known for having a really, really good relationship with Jamal Abdel Nasser, who was the
really.
president of Egypt. And they say that Jamal Abdel Nasser, respected him so much as a religious leader, as a spiritual leader, that he was the one guy that could that could insult Jamal Abdel Nasser and get away with it.
Not
Like
die.
when he would scold him, when he would tell him he was doing something wrong, Abdel Nasser would listen. And when Jamal Abdel Nasser killed Sayyid Qutb, rahimullah, um, Sheikh Ibrahim Nayas, he wrote him a letter saying, "Don't kill this man." He said, "Don't execute him." Jamal Abdel Nasser, right before he was killing Sayyid Qutb, he saw the letter and he told the people, he said, "I'm going to kill Qutb and then I'm going to open the letter." Because he knew what was going to be in the letter. He
Oh,
didn't want to
wow.
openly disobey the sheikh, right? So he kills Sayyid Qutb and then he opens the letter. And he thinks that, there's a loophole. Like, oh, too
Oh,
late,
I
already
didn't know
killed him.
already. I
I
already
didn't
killed him.
openly
Wow.
disobey Sheikh Ibrahim Niyas.
That's
So then when
incredible.
Jamal Abdel Nasser dies, Sheikh Ibrahim's grandson has a dream. His grandson was Sheikh Hassan Sise, but at that point he was a young man. He wasn't a sheikh yet. And he says, I had a dream where Jamal Abdel Nasser was in the next life and he was not in a good state. And Sheikh Ibrahim says, it's because he killed the pious man, Sayyid Qutb. He killed this commentator of Quran. And he says that we tried to get him to stop, but he didn't listen. So this is
Wow.
the role. Even in modern times, you see examples of scholars who provide independent critique of government authorities, and that's the way that it should be. But it's really, really important for Muslims to look at the way that even Muslim countries are ruled by this authoritarian modern nation state that has this very European lineage.
For sure. No, they definitely are a copy paste. I mean, just from the way they dress and carry themselves, none of them have beards. None of them wear thobes or kufis or no, seriously. And even the golf ones that wear it, I mean, that's just a zahir. The batin is just the same. Their whole worldview, the way they understand things, and you can tell by who their friends are. I mean, they're all great allies with America and the other Western countries, and they're
I,
secretly allies with Israel. I mean, not openly, of course, but
I have a funny story about this too. There was
mhm,
So I met a guy who had studied under Ali Juma, who's the Grand Mufti of Egypt, was the
mhm,
Grand Mufti of Egypt, and he was a big, big supporter of Sisi, who has this whole awful human rights record, one of the worst dictators probably on the planet today. And I asked him, I said, in the Mubarak days, Ali Juma would not talk about politics. Like, did you ever hear him talk about politics in your personal classes? And he says the only thing he would say about politics is he would say, Mubarak la yusalli. Hosni Mubarak, the then
doesn't pray.
president of Egypt, doesn't pray. And I told this to my one of my professors in undergrad, who's one of the best hadith scholars on the planet, and he got very angry. Actually, he said it's not about salah. He says
Uh,
a ruler. He said it's better to have a ruler who doesn't pray 5 times a day, who doesn't pray at all, but doesn't oppress people, than to have a
mm,
ruler who prays all night but oppresses people. So I was just
right.
thinking that when you were saying like thobes and all of that, it doesn't matter what they wear. All you want from a ruler is that they don't oppress the masses. The
Mm.
the prayer, the outfits, all of that, you look up to religious leaders for that. You don't need a sultan who does those things necessarily. You don't need a president or
Mhm.
any sort of ruler who does those things. The only job of a ruler is not to oppress people.
So as long as he's Muslim, he doesn't necessarily have to be pious in your view to be okay, as long as he does a good job.
Yeah. Or even in like the context of the modern nation state, I'd say it's better to have a non-Muslim who gives people their rights than to have a Muslim who is oppressing people.
I think I would agree, but that might be controversial to some people because we're so stuck on the external, what we see. Oh, he's a Muslim, he's not a Muslim. We fall
Yeah.
into that a lot when we have Muslim politicians in America, and Muslims just feel the need to support them just because they're Muslim, but they don't even know what their policies are, who they are, what they're doing.
Yeah, and their politics are the same old DNC
Yeah.
line.
But
I
actually,
actually
I think
yeah.
we see the proof of what you just said, though, because Muslims overwhelmingly supported Bernie, and he was by all, I think, by all accounts, an atheist identifying culturally Jewish guy. So
Uh-huh.
essentially, as far away from being Muslim as you can get, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, Dearborn, where I live near, it's pretty Muslim, and overwhelmingly the Muslims voted for him. So
I think Bernie said he believes in God actually, but he calls himself like a secular Jew. He's not someone
okay,
who's very religious.
yeah, exactly. So he's
Yeah.
not. I mean, he's not at all close to what we
Us
would say,
religiously.
yeah, us
Yeah.
religiously at all. At best maybe culturally identifies with being Jewish, but Islam and we're religious. But anyway,
Mm.
so I think maybe the Muslim community agrees with you generally speaking. But then after that, you went back to Jordan, that's what I talked about in the beginning. So that's where we met.
Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts about how was Jordan maybe the second time compared to the first time? How much had you changed? Because you were studying, you began, actually let's begin with the MTS, because you begin at MTS, so you graduate from undergrad.
Yeah. Graduated from undergrad and I actually spent time in South Africa the summer before my
Oh
senior
right, I
thesis.
forgot that. Tell me about
And
that.
yeah, so I write my senior thesis on this actually goes to what we were talking about actually. The I write my senior thesis on the role that Muslims played in the South African anti-apartheid struggle. And Muslims are between 1 and 2% of the population of South Africa,
Hmm.
but they made up 16% of the first democratic parliament.
Wow, so
Nelson Mandela,
they're less present than Muslims here in America. I think they're at
yeah.
least 2 or 3%.
Yeah, and I came back from writing my thesis. Nelson Mandela's cellmate in jail was
Yeah,
a Muslim. All of these
amazing.
Islamic scholars opposed apartheid, and they said we have to oppose racism because anti-racism is in our religion. The
For
Prophet Muhammad
sure.
SAW, in his final sermon, what does he
There's no
say? He says,
difference.
an Arab has no superiority over non-Arab. A non-Arab has no superiority over an Arab. A black person has no superiority over a white person. A white person has no superiority over a black person. And then the Prophet Muhammad SAW, his last words before he leaves this earth is he says, Salah, Salah, Salah. to be firm on your prayer, to be firm on your prayer, to be firm on your prayer. And then he says to help the poor and the weak in society.
Yeah.
So
So
these,
the full text of that hadith is لا فرق بين العربي والعجمي ولا الأسود ولا الأبيض ولا الأحمر ولا الأسمر. So I think in Islamic society, someone who's our skin tone might have been called red or yellow or something.
uh-huh,
إلا بالتقوى, which means other than piety.
other than in their consciousness of God.
Right.
And so these Muslims in South Africa, they say it's part of our Islamic values to oppose the system of apartheid.
So they were mostly South Asians brought over by the Brits, right? The Muslims in South Africa.
So they were either Indians who were either
Hmm.
brought as indentured servants in the late 1800s, or they were businessmen from Gujarat who came in like the
Right.
early 20th century, like the 1930s. And then there was also a Malay community that
Hmm.
were brought over as slaves by the Dutch in the
Wow.
1700s, and they were there were shayukh in Malaysia and Indonesia who were Sufi sheikhs who were resisting Dutch colonialism, and the
Wow.
Dutch basically captured these shayukh, and they said these are the people leading the resistance against colonialism. So the way that we stop this from happening is we capture them and we
Hmm.
bring them to the Cape, where the city of Cape Town is, but the
Oh, just
broader
drop them
province,
off somewhere really far away.
drop them off in the middle of nowhere in the mountains, and they would have these like ranches where they would stay out with their families, but they couldn't really leave because the terrain was built that way that you can't escape. And then they brought slaves from Malaysia and Indonesia, and they told these slaves that you're not allowed to practice your religion. If they were to even pray as we pray in front of the Dutch, if the Dutch were to find out that these slaves are praying, they would be hung, they would be killed. They weren't allowed to fast,
Wow.
they weren't allowed to do all of these sorts of things. So what these slaves did is some of them would find these shayuk on the mountains, and they would say, "This is what our conditions are. What should we do?" And the shayuk, they told the slaves, they said, just recite these zikrs and sing them like hymns so the Dutch don't know what they're saying.
Oh.
And the way Islam was preserved in the Cape for 150 years was through them singing these zikrs. And then the British
Wow.
came, and when they conquered the Cape, they gave religious freedom, and finally
Hmm.
Muslims were allowed to pray in public. They were allowed to do
Hmm.
they were allowed to do all these sorts of things. And there's also the Shayuk had a culture of actually in the Dutch historical records that they
Hmm.
were known for performing miracles. So there's
Wow.
the story of one guy who was jailed on Robben Island. He was a Sufi sheikh, and he was jailed on Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela and all these guys would later be jailed. And Robben Island is like Alcatraz, where the water is
Wow.
too rough to like swim out, so you're stuck there. And the sheikh, he said he drew a boat on his wall, and he said to the people that he was in jail with, he said, "I'm gonna go see my sheikh tomorrow." And
Mhm.
they were like, "Okay, like whatever the hell that means." So then this guy disappears from Robben Island. No one knows where he went. And a couple of days later, they find his dead body miles away at the grave of his sheikh, who's in the mountains in Cape Town, somewhere that is
Wow.
impossible for someone to swim and just walk to, and then have their dead body there. So it's
Incredible.
they had this culture of miracles, and so Muslims are mostly either South Asian or they're the descendants of these
Hmm.
Malaysian slaves, and
Hmm.
then there's a growing African indigenous Muslim community in South
Wow.
Africa.
So what you just described, it's called in Muslim literature Tayul Ard, which means literally like moving across the land, but it implies like a miraculous movement, like you were describing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
So you go to South Africa, you spend months there, you write a thesis as your senior thesis, and
Hmm.
then you start attending Harvard. So can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, so I started an MTS, what's called a Master's in Theological Studies at Harvard.
Hmm.
Um, I started studying more of like the Islamic philosophical tradition there, which is something I really benefited from because my understanding of Islamic studies before that was really like historical. Like my thesis is a historical study.
Hmm.
It's also an anthropological study in a lot of ways. So history and anthropology were my lens of studying religion before that, with a little bit of traditional education, just like the basics. And then when I go to Harvard, I start reading the works of people like Ghazali, of Ibn Sina,
Hmm.
of all of these sorts of people. And then Sheikh Ibrahim Niyas, the sheikh that I was talking about before,
Hmm.
the very famous West African sheikh who advised Jamal Abdel Nasser, I end up I end up reading about his life because his grandson is a professor of Islamic studies at my university, Professor Usman Khan,
Hmm.
and I started attending dhikrs that are at his house on Friday nights. And this is
Nice.
where it's complicated that the academic study of religion makes people atheists, right? Because I'm studying under this sheikh who's a professor, and he's inviting us to his house on Friday nights
Hmm.
to do dhikr, right? And this is a private thing, not that many students there, and we get like really good personal interaction with him. And he's teaching us not just information, but he's teaching us how to be people. And
Hmm.
eventually I end up, I want to say I end up deciding to join his tariqa, but I
Hmm.
don't even end up deciding to join. Just some things happen. Basically, one day, me and my roommate, we used to always talk about how cool would it be if we were his murids. And we never actually followed through with it or whatever, right? One day after an event, I asked my roommate where he's going. And he says, I'm going to the professor's office hours and I think you should come. And I say, for what reason? And
Hmm.
he says, I'm going to join the tariqa. I'm going to make bay'ah to him. And then, so I decided to join, and that was truly, really life changing. Just to have, you know, one sheikh who kind of guides you along the path and who has this kind of rich tradition, who has, I made bay'ah to him, he made bay'ah to Sheikh Ibrahim, who
Yeah.
made bay'ah to a person, who made bay'ah to a person, who
To the
made bay'ah to the
prophet.
Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu
Yeah.
Alaihi Wasallam.
So yeah.
So even the act of bay'ah, the way
Hmm.
you do it is like I put my hands down
In
and he
his
puts
hands,
my
yeah.
hands above them, right? And as I was looking at his hands, and my professor is a very big guy. He's like 6'6". He has these ginormous hands, and I just think to myself like, wow, like these hands touched hands that touched hands
Yeah.
that touched the hands of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Like it's just beautiful to have that direct connection.
Right. This is a big part of our tradition. It's I think it's different than the West where it's very individual. But for
Yeah,
us, it's connection to connection. We're all interconnected. That's a big part of our tradition. Every single part of our education system has ijazas, but those are passed down from person. So when you finish studying a text like Al-Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Tahawi, whatever, the sheikh gives you an ijaza, but he got it from someone who got it from someone who got it from someone who got it from the author ultimately. So we have this idea of we can't just pick up a book or just learn anything. You need someone who learn from someone. It's this mentorship. This system that again they had in the West via the Greeks and things like that, but they lost for whatever
mhm,
reason over the centuries, millennia. But that we've kept alive, alhamdulillah, that we have this idea that we need mentors, we need this connection to the origin of our tradition. So I think
yeah.
that's beautiful. So you're I mean Harvard is considered the best university maybe in the West. So you're in the best of the West. How was that experience to go to the premier institution of Western learning?
Uh-huh. I there's this kind of mystification of it at first, but then after a couple of weeks you realize that it's just like any other school. um I learned a lot. I benefited obviously in finding a sheikh there, which I don't know how many Harvard students have done
Mhm.
that, probably a handful.
All
But
right,
alhamdulillah,
yeah.
I benefited a lot. I learned about the Islamic intellectual tradition there from like a theological and philosophical perspective.
Hmm.
I read the works of Ghazali, of Ibn Sina, of like Abhari, of all of these sorts of people, and I was exposed to really amazing faculty there, and it was really nice, alhamdulillah. And then the summer between, so my master's is a 2-year program. I'm at the tail end of the second year, and then last
But
year is
you're
my
done. You're done as far as being in Harvard though, because you're
yeah,
completing
because
it
of
on
Corona.
Zoom University.
Yeah, Zoom University now. So in like 5 weeks, inshallah, I should have be done
Inshallah.
with my master's. And but the summer between, I spent at Qasid, and at
Hmm.
this point, I kind of knew a little bit more about traditional studies. So I really stacked my schedule at Qasid with like studying with traditional Islamic scholars in
Hmm.
Jordan.
Yeah.
So I spent my days, studying a lot of these, really major Islamic texts. And after 10 weeks there, I was amazed at just how much I had learned. And as I was going into the second year of my master's program, I determined that I really, really need more traditional education. I know a lot about the Western academic study of religion, but I know the value of traditional Islamic study, and it's something that I want to do more of in the future.
Hmm.
So that's where I
How,
am right now, kind of like trying to figure that out.
yeah. So we were talking that you were interested in going overseas again, but this Corona is kind of making everything difficult, unfortunately. But we were talking about Egypt was on your radar, and I've thought about that as well.
Yeah,
The idea of going somewhere. There's so many shuyukh there. Alhamdulillah, it's the cost of living there is cheap relative to the money we have, so it's more doable than some other places. Than like Jordan, for example, the cost of living there might be as high as in America. So
yeah.
is that still on the radar, or is Corona in the way of that?
We'll see. I don't know what's happening right now, but inshallah, if it's possible, I would love
Okay.
to spend time in Egypt. Um, but yeah, and I think like I wrote this article for Muslim Matters actually. It was called like 14 lessons I learned from
Mm-hmm.
studying Aqidah, from studying Islamic theology
Mm-hmm.
with a sheikh in Jordan. And it's just the just things like that. It really just moved me to
Mm-hmm.
it, because you're not just studying a theology text, but the sheikh has the goal, the person you're studying with has the goal of imparting life lessons upon you. And I
Right.
think that's really, really important. And I really think that amongst young Muslims, they, even if you don't want to be a scholar, even if you don't want to become some sheikh or something, like for me personally, I don't really care for that. I just want to be a Muslim who understands my religion better so that I can use
Right.
it to benefit society. So I
So
can
there,
be so I can be like Sheikh Ibrahim
yeah,
Niyaz, so I can be like
inshallah,
Malcolm,
inshallah,
so I can be like
kullana.
these people who were deep devoted Muslims but were able to
Mm-hmm.
benefit the broader world, right?
Right.
So I really, really think it's important for young Muslims to just take a class on the 40
Mm-hmm.
hadiths of Nawawi, or take a basic Aqidah class and to find someone, preferably in your area, that you can sit with
Yeah,
and
right.
benefit from
And
the
learn.
message.
Right. Yeah. So that's one thing. We're all in the same Abrahamic tradition, but there's similarities and differences. So one of the differences with Christianity is they have a clergy. They have an idea that certain people go study and other people just go to church and leave. And other people, they're not memorizing anything about the Bible. They don't understand, anything other than very basic theology, like, the fiqh of prayer, like they know how to pray, but there's not even a fiqh for that. There isn't, I find it hard to say there's a Sharia in the sense that we understand it.
Yeah,
Versus in Judaism is the complete opposite. It's understood that every practicing Jewish person, I'm not talking about secular or conservative, but the Orthodox Jews, every single one of them is like a sheikh. Every single one of them does a decade of studying Torah and learning and all that. And Islam is borrowing from that tradition in the sense that we don't have a clergy. Every one of us is supposed to be like a sheikh. We're all supposed to have Islamic knowledge. We're all supposed to learn how to read and write Arabic. We're all supposed to understand how hadith works and how fiqh works. And sadly, in the Muslim world, you tend to either know Arabic if you're an Arab or be familiar via adjacency, or there's a lot of knowledge available in your mother tongue. If you speak Urdu, Persian, Malay, there's enough texts available. The average person just from being couched in this society knows a lot about Islam. Versus in the West, there isn't that societal thing, and they're not learning Arabic or anything, and they don't know that much. And I notice this a lot of times in class, maybe on an unrelated note, not unrelated to what I'm saying, but unrelated to religion in the sense that something about Islam would come up and there'd be Muslims in class because there's a lot of Muslims in this area.
in Michigan,
And
yeah.
yeah, and they would ask a question about Islam and people just wouldn't know the answer to it. It would be a very basic question. So we were learning in some American poli-sci class, like poli-sci 101, just to fulfill a requirement, about how in Dearborn there was this issue with the, what was it? The nativity scene, that's the name. The nativity scene was placed on City Hall, and this was a controversy, and the city got sued. And it happened to be around the time when Dearborn was becoming increasingly Muslim, so it became a controversy. Muslims, although I don't think a Muslim sued, I think an atheist group sued the city, which is they're always the ones making trouble with this stuff. But anyway, so the Muslims obviously they couldn't care less. They would probably support it, So especially considering most of the Muslims in Dearborn, especially at the time, would have been Lebanese. So to a Lebanese person, it's very normal to see Christian stuff. I mean,
Yeah, Lebanon's like
that's
40% Christian.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
the biggest group. It's a plurality, as far as we think, because who knows, but not to get into that. But it's
Uh-huh.
Christian. So anyway, they got sued, and the teacher was saying, yeah, this was an issue. A few churches got together and they bought a plot of land directly next to City Hall, and that's where the nativity scene is now. It's just I guess it's a statement. It's the same result. But then she
Uh-huh.
said, but the Muslims never had an issue with presenting their things. Do you know why? And the Muslims, they didn't know what to say. And she said Muslims don't have a nativity scene for Ramadan or Muhammad's birth or anything. You know why? They don't want to put a statue of Muhammad up. And the
They don't
Muslims
put
didn't answer
depictions
this
of their
question.
prophets.
Yeah.
Oh
And I
wow.
said, because there's no depictions in Islam. You can't have a statue of Muhammad in Islam.
We
And
don't
then
draw our
yeah.
prophets. Yeah.
And then she was saying, okay, why? And the other kids, one of them was saying like, I don't know, because it couldn't be accurate enough or something like that. Which, yeah, I guess it's technically true, but that's missing the main point, which is there's no depictions of prophets according to most the average understanding of Islam, right? Not getting into minority understandings
Uh-huh.
or things like that are like in Ramadan, can you drink water? And there'd be a kid, obviously from a non-practicing family, didn't know that you couldn't drink water. There's lots of these basic, really basic fiqh questions
Hmm.
would come up, and I noticed that kids, even ones from practicing families, they wouldn't like people. Their understanding of Islam is so uninformed that they can't differentiate between the different currents of Islamic knowledge. Again, I don't expect a non-Muslim, but I'm talking about a kid in I knew like kids in the Ahlul Bayt Shia student association at my school, and I was in their group chat talking. I love the group chat, but I'm talking to them, and one of them was like posting stuff from Islam Q&A, and I was like, "Do you realize this is like a Wahhabi website?" And then he's like, "No, I thought it was like the WikiHow of Islam, Islam Q&A. Whatever you look up in Islam, it's there." Yeah, one of them was like, "How did you know it was Wahhabi?" I'm like, "Because of the way the guy's like phrasing his writing, Like
Uh-huh.
anyone who writes about Salaf, 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 but in a response, but doesn't mention any of the four Imams of Islam, it's just a Salafi. Like, just look
Yeah.
at the presentation of the website. It's like, look at the answers and questions. Like, it's obvious he's a Salafi. But I
Uh-huh.
realized that even people who were inclined to join a religious group, they didn't have enough of a grounding in Islamic sciences to differentiate a Salafi from a Shia website. And it just seems like, come on, like, again, I don't want to be a hater. I don't want to feel like I'm better than you. Like, everyone lives a different life. Everyone say different things. But I think that at least as average Muslims, we should be able to have a basic grounding in fiqh and aqidah and things like that to at least differentiate, know who to get our deen from. This can be dangerous. A lot of times you see Muslims second generation from the West, the ones that become Salafis or extremists. It's because they don't understand Islamic sciences. They can't differentiate between mainstream, Orthodox Islam and the extremist currents of the Salafis, and of course there's extremists in the Shia sects, but they're such a small minority that it's almost like worthless to spend time talking about them. Not to say that
Hmm.
it doesn't exist, but regardless, they can't tell the difference between mainstream Orthodox Islam and the crazies because they don't
Uh-huh.
have a grounding. So a lot of times I get asked by white people, how do we end extremists? How do we end extremists and things like that? And they're expecting something like promoting Imam Tawhidi or something like that. But really, the answer is we need American Muslims to teach their kids Islam. Because if
Yeah.
you don't teach your kid Islam, he's going to get curious and he's going to go on the internet and he's going to find Asim al-Hakim and Munajid and
Uh-huh.
or even mainstream Salafi thinkers who aren't as overtly Salafi, but get you in that
Uh-huh.
like people like
I don't
Zakir
even know who
Naik.
these are, by the way.
So Asim al-Hakim is a huge English language Salafi guy. I've done a lot of
Uh-huh.
research in the Salafis, and Munajid
Yeah.
is the guy who runs Islam Q&A. Zakir
Uh-huh.
Naik you probably know, but
Oh
he's
yeah,
also a
yeah. Of course,
Salafi.
I know
So
talking.
they go on the internet, they type in, if you Google any question about Islam, you're guaranteed to get a Salafi result as the one of the top three. And they go in there and it's matching Protestantism. This Quran and Sunnah, by disregarding the scholars, just Quran and Sunnah. It's like the way Protestants approach their Bible, just read from the Bible, disregarding the scholars. They don't believe in that stuff. So we have this issue of the lack of competency in aqidah and fiqh and stuff is actually causing apostasy, extremism. Uh, it's just causing a lot of havoc in our community. And I feel like if we just had a basic understanding of our religion at the level that people in Muslim countries do, that we would just save ourselves a lot of trouble. There would be a lot less messes to clean up, a lot less fires to put out.
Yeah. It's also an issue. Like I would meet people in college who would say, they had, like we talked about earlier, they'd internalize a lot of the Fox News narrative, and they'd be like,
Wow.
one of the guys. Like I remember, I was sitting with him in college. Me and this guy, I love this dude. Like we would, I don't even. He's Muslim, but he's influenced by a lot of this sort of like Fox
Hmm.
News narrative and stuff. And he said it would make it really hard for him to practice his religion. And one
Right.
time we're sitting in the library, and he says, "How do we reconcile the fact that the Prophet Muhammad SAW, he either lived in Mecca where he was being oppressed by non-Muslims, or he was ruling and treating people well. But is there an Islamic paradigm where you live under a non-Muslim ruler and you live as free Muslims?" And I said, wait. The Muslims are in Mecca and then they go to Medina, right? Where's the place that they go between that? They go to Abyssinia. They go to
Hmm.
present-day Ethiopia.
Where the
Ethiopia is a
Christians
country
were,
where
yeah.
Najashi, he's a just Christian ruler, and
Hmm.
he gives the Muslims their rights. And Ethiopia to this day is not a majority Muslim country. So the idea that
Right.
if someone has a base understanding of Islamic history, if they know these things, then they're able to sort of subvert this sort of Fox News narrative. But
Right.
if they're not taught this, and if they don't go out and seek it, because
Hmm.
at a certain age, like you can say, oh, I lived in a community in the middle of nowhere where I wasn't taught my deen, or my parents didn't teach me and stuff. But at a certain age, you have the responsibility. If
Right.
you're like
Right.
a upper middle class, Arab kid, you're an upper middle class Desi kid, you can take a gap year and you can
Yeah.
go
Go
to Qalam
abroad.
Institute, or you can go abroad, or you can
Right.
go somewhere where you can understand your religion,
Just
right? So at a certain point, you have the responsibility yourself.
right. And
Yeah.
like you said, just a basic understanding can dispel a lot of these misunderstandings from both sides, because we're facing two threats really. On one hand, we have the Salafis, Wahhabis, other fringe groups. The Shias, Aqid have their fringe groups, and other offshoots of Islam that are weird and dangerous and aqidah ways and iman ways. And then on the other side, you have the atheists and the secularists and the Islamophobes from usually evangelical Christians, sometimes Jews who are really pro-Israel. But
Uh-huh.
regardless of their orientation, they're coming from both sides. And we're falling victim to either one or the other, sometimes both. So, for example, one time I was arguing with an Arab who had apostatized in university, and they were saying, you know, Islam, you want to see the end goal of Islam, the end of Islam? Look at ISIS. What they're doing, that's Islam. Everything they're doing is from Hadith. Look at Palmyra. Look at whatever they're blowing up. That's what Islam is ultimately. They're blowing up those things. They're decapitating those people. They're burning people in cages, just like the Hadith said. Not even getting into the weakness of those hadiths or whatever, but
Yeah.
saying on one hand, you have the Wahhabis saying, yeah, that's Islam, burning people alive, cutting them up, destroying Palmyra, destroying the Buddhist statues.
And
And on
also,
the
I
other
should
hand,
add in that, not
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but I would
of
also
course,
add in, like, most Salafis in the U.S., they're not down with that stuff. Like,
that's true.
even the most extreme Salafis in the United States,
Yeah.
99% of them, they're not okay with
Yeah, they're
violence.
not the jihadi types. Those types tend
Yeah,
to be in the East. And
yeah,
thankfully, people in America, they're still more moderate in that sense.
yeah,
Not to
yeah.
say that, I mean, there's tons of Salafis, I know Salafis
Mm,
personally, who are quietists and they live a normal life. They're just understand religion is different, but
yeah.
they don't do any of that stuff.
Like, the
But
Salafis I know are actually, like, very, like, nice, good people for the
mhm.
most part. And, like, I might have some theological differences with them, but, like, the most extremism I see from them is, like, they'll tell me to, like, stand feet to feet, shoulder to shoulder,
Yeah.
roll my pants up, like, stuff like that.
Yeah. So again, not to paint them with the brush.
Yeah.
Of course, there's Salafis like Yasser Ghadi, and there's
Uh-huh.
Salafis like Bin Laden, right? So
Yeah.
obviously that's a spectrum. I don't want to fall into the Western trap where
Yeah.
they just see how Salafis are all crazy. Of
I
course,
don't even know if Yasser Qadhi is a Salafi at
I
this
think he used to identify, but
point. Yeah.
regardless, when he was a Salafi, of course,
Yeah.
there's sane scholars who are Salafis. Mufti Meng, for example, he's a
Uh-huh.
perfectly normal, great guy. Never doesn't believe in terrorism. But
Yeah. I
my
don't know if
point
he's
is,
a Salafi either. But anyways.
I think he
Yeah.
identifies as a Deobandi, but I think he's basically in effect a Salafi. Essentially, not to
Uh-huh.
get into a tangent, but I'm
Yeah.
talking about the jihadi, non-quietist, activist strain of Salafism that believe, the Al Qaeda, ISIS strain of Salafism. So on one
Uh-huh.
hand, you have them saying, yeah, that is Islam. What's going on, that's Islam. And then you have the Islamophobes saying, yeah, we agree with them. That is Islam. And then you
Yeah.
have these people pressed between those two things. So this one guy said, destroying churches, destroying Virgin Mary statues, destroying Palmyra and all that, that's Islam. And I said, and how this one Salafi in Egypt went on Egyptian TV and said, I would blow up the pyramids. If the Khilaf of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi could reign here, we'd blow up the pyramids. And I was saying, actually, like the guy he's named after, Sayyidina Abu Bakr, he reigned over all that land. Maybe not him, actually. Who did the
Uh,
Khilafah reach Masr in his reign, or was it Amr?
Maybe it was either him or Umar ibn al-Khattab.
So
But the
regardless,
point is,
his
Muslims have been there for over
Muslims,
a
yeah. So
thousand
Umar ibn
years.
al-Khattab ruled over the pyramids. He ruled over Palmyra. He ruled over all the churches. He went to Jerusalem personally. He didn't destroy any of that stuff. So what ISIS is doing is not what they would have done, because they could have did it and they didn't do it.
Yeah.
And specifically, when Imam Ali, salam, by the time he was caliph, and he sent Malik al-Ashtar to be the governor of Egypt, he wrote that really famous line: "If he's not a brother in religion, he's your brother in humanity." And the gist of that letter is, you're dealing with an ancient civilization. Tread lightly. Don't think these people are any less than us just because they're not Muslim, because they're idolaters or whatever. So if you just understand our tradition, you'll see that so many of these misconceptions are they're not there. It's not correct. It's a total
Yeah.
misunderstanding. It's a modern understanding. But again, we don't have that. And when I said that, you could tell they hadn't thought of that before.
Yeah.
And again, not to blame them. They're the victim of these things we're talking about.
Ignorance.
Of course, yeah, they're the
Yeah.
victim. But I think that we could just do a lot better if everyone just had we're so obsessed with graduating, getting married, getting a car, getting a house. If this became normal for us, the same way that American Jews, it's normal for them to take a gap year to go to Israel, not to compare fiqh with Israel, but the
Not
same
to
way,
compare,
the same way that
understand your religion with
that the
Zionism.
Mormons, they do 2 years, and a lot of
Yeah.
religious groups, it's normal for them to do a year or 2 years of stuff. Why can't we make it normal for American Muslims? After you graduate, just do a year of studying in the Muslim world. Think how great that would be. All of our
Yeah.
understandings of Islam would improve. A lot of people would probably come back married. The Muslim world would have great engagement, engaging with the West and the East, Muslims in both sides of the world. It would
Uh-huh.
economically benefit and culturally benefit the Muslim world to have these Muslims in the West with their money, their ideas, their human capital to go there. Maybe some people would stay. Maybe they'd bring people with them. There would be greater scholastic engagement and interconnectivity if this could just be a normalized part of our culture. Whereas if you do it, they say, oh, so-and-so is just too lazy to go to medical school. That's why he's, running around in Jordan or Egypt or Turkey or Iran or
Uh-huh.
whatever. So we're just so obsessed with this American rat race that we don't want to just take a year off to study our deen and
Yeah.
learn things that we'll carry and pass on to our kids, inshallah.
There's a really beautiful story of Umar bin al-Khattab radiallahu
Mm-hmm.
anhu. When the Muslims take control of Jerusalem, the head of the church asks him to pray in the church. He says it would be our honor for you to pray in this church. And Umar bin al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, who is the second caliph, so the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam leaves this world in 632 AD, and then Abu Bakr as-Siddiq rules for a couple of years, and then Umar comes next. And
Mm-hmm.
the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam says that if there were to be a prophet after me, it would be Umar. So he
Mm-hmm.
goes to Jerusalem and he enters his church, and the priest of the church says, can you pray here? And this is the church of the Holy Sepulchre, by the
Mm-hmm.
way, in Jerusalem. And
Right.
Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, he says, I can't pray here because if I were to pray here, the Muslims would turn it into a mosque, and I
Wow.
want the holiest site in Christianity to be preserved. So then
Wow.
he prays across the street, and if you go to Jerusalem today, you see the church of the Holy Sepulchre, and
Yeah.
then right next to it you
Is the
see the
Masjid
mosque
of
of
Umar
Umar.
bin al-Khattab.
And
Yeah.
the people who control the Church of the Holy Sepulchre,
Are
the
the
people who have the
Muslims.
keys to the church, are Muslims because, and this goes back to the time. Actually, I'm not sure about this. Someone in Jerusalem, a Christian man, told me that
Yeah.
this goes back to the time of Umar.
They were
But
arguing the Christians can decide who the Waqf was, who get to control it.
yeah,
So they hand it over to the Muslims. And to this day, that's the case with not just that, but other. I saw it in a documentary once. There was a Muslim family that had been like living in this home for like 700 years, and they also had control. Literally the old keys. The key was made out of bronze, like really old. You could tell it was that old. And they're like, we control this church that we live right across from, these Palestinian Muslims and Christians, because the Christians couldn't decide who would get to control it, which
yeah,
subgroup
amongst
or
the
family.
various
So they
denominations.
just said, okay, we'll hand it over to Muslims. They're neutral. They have no interest. They're not going to sell the property or something. What are they going to do? Turn to a mosque? Like, they're
Yeah.
neutral. There will be no infighting as to who can control. It's just a formality to
Mm.
them. So I thought, it's another example of this kind of co-living, this pluralism that we talked about. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow. So right now you're looking in the future, inshallah. We'll see what happens with Egypt if you're able to go. If Miss Rona, as she's now being called, if Corona decides to go away, or if we can figure out a vaccine. If not, maybe it'll be Zoom Azhar.
Yeah. Al-Azhar online.
As
Oh,
Azhar.
did you want to talk about being a chaplain also?
Yeah, I forgot to bring that up. That was one of the points. But so you became the Muslim chaplain of Boston College.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So how did that happen? What was that like?
So the summer after my senior year, after graduating from undergrad, I'm at Busboys and Poets in DC with an old friend of mine who
Mm-hmm.
had just completed the program before me, and he's kind of giving me the lowdown on the program, like take classes with this guy, do this, get your languages down with these books, all of that sort of stuff. And then he looks at me and he goes, "Do you want to be a chaplain?" And I say to him, like, "Not really. Like, I'm
SubhanAllah,
all."
the best opportunities just fall on your lap, when you're not even looking for it.
Yeah, so he was the chaplain at Boston College before me, and he kind of passed the baton to me in a way, and it's been really good, and it's really exposed me to Muslim youth in ways that I hadn't been exposed to them
Right.
before. And these kids are, in some cases even my age, um,
Wow.
but some of them, like, I entered the chaplaincy at 22, and these kids are between 18 and 22, so some of them
Nice.
are even my age,
Wow.
and there's a really personal aspect to being a chaplain. Like I've learned a lot of things. Like I've learned how to, talk about Islam in ways that even the lowest common denominator can understand in,
Wow.
10, 20, 30-minute talks.
Yeah. I'm sure
Um,
you get different levels of ilm coming in. I mean, not just people who are learned, but maybe kids who come from a secular Muslim household or something like that.
yeah. So that's being a chaplain has really given me hope in Muslim youth in a lot of ways, because
Alhamdulillah.
oftentimes people say, Muslim youth are like this or like that, but for the most part, Muslim youth, whether they have attended, like, I know there are students at Boston College who have attended Quran intensive at Qalam Institute and spent a whole summer studying classical Arabic, and their knowledge of classical Arabic and their recitation of Quran is probably better than mine. And there are
Wow.
also students at Boston College who, before they came to college, they didn't really know how to pray. They didn't go to Jummah before that. And what I've noticed is a common denominator between both of these kind of groups of students and everyone in the middle is that they're really eager to learn their religion, and they're
Wow.
just looking for to be directed to the right sources to learn about their religion. So the one thing that being a chaplain has taught me is that we have this class of students, we have this group of young people in the United States, young Muslims, who they're not people who have bit the bullet of like secularism, which has caused us to become less religious, and that's the idea that religion is something that you limit to an hour on Sunday or an hour on
Hmm.
Saturday or an hour on Friday. These are people who really, really want to learn about their religion, and they want to engage society based on this Islamic
Wow.
ethos. So
Alhamdulillah.
it should motivate us to be people who are as motivated and as eager as them, and also to find people who can teach these young people.
Wow. Yeah, that's, I think, going back to what I said earlier, we just really need ulama, shuyukh, people who can guide the people who want to find knowledge instead of, God forbid them just going out into the depths alone and finding the wrong stuff, going down a wrong path. So inshallah, there'll be good leadership in our community
Yeah.
that
And then
not that doesn't just engage with the aunties and uncles who can donate money to the masjid, but also engages with the kids.
yeah, because they're the future. And then
Right.
another thing is that like I'm not someone who's like a sheikh or something. Like I barely know the basics,
Mm.
but I try to teach what I know to others, and that's something that we as Muslims need to
Right.
understand is important. Also, that whatever little that you learn, you have a
Right. Right.
responsibility to teach it to others. Oftentimes, people say, I'm not qualified to teach this thing. I'm not qualified to do
Mhm.
this, this, and this. And the reality is that you need to know your lane, you need to know your limitations. If you're someone who's not all that learned, you don't go around giving fatwas on the
Right. Yeah.
permissibility of like blood transfusions. But if someone wants to learn how to pray, you teach them. If
Yeah.
someone
Yeah.
wance to know the
Right.
meaning of verses of the Quran, you tell them. If
Yeah.
someone wants to have like a critique of secularism and you're
Inshallah.
aware of
Yeah.
it, then
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
teach them.
This is an issue that I have. People, maybe they think I'm mutakabir, they think I'm excessively proud. When I do Q&As on Instagram where I tell people about Islam and things like that, and some people, everyone's a critic. They say, "Oh, well, are you a sheikh, or
Yeah,
are you at that level yet?" And I say, "Well, yeah, I'm not." A lot of times, most of the questions actually, not most generally, but specifically regarding to Islamic law, most of the time I just reply and say, "I don't know. Ask someone else. Defer to
yeah,
someone higher than me." But if it's something super basic, like what does tariqah mean, or you know what's the gist of Sufism, we can do that. And I think this is one thing that the shuyukh, the ulama in the Muslim world have spoke about. And they said, if you're a Western student of knowledge, do that in your home country, exhaust your resources, then come here. We're tired of people saying, I want to just start, and they show up to Egypt or Jordan or Turkey and they don't even know how to read and write Arabic. And they
yeah,
say, I want to start, because they think that, Islamic knowledge, you need to go to the best. You need to go to the kibar al-ulama to learn. They say, no, man, you can learn how to read Quran from the dude who prays at
at
your
your
mosque
mosque.
every day.
Yeah,
You don't need to. You just pass on what little you know, and then you'll pick up something from someone above you and pass it down, and we'll all go up together.
yeah,
But we don't need to be an expert to tell someone something that's within your level. Just know your level. If you know middle school math teacher, elementary school sibling, but don't teach your high school sibling. Simple as that. So
yeah.
inshallah, we can all help each other.
It's also like, people get on me also. They're like, you in your Instagram Q&As, like you'll answer like fiqh questions and like stuff that like a mufti can answer. And what I do is I'll ask a mufti and then I'll post a screenshot, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
my understanding is like I know people who have studied, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years overseas and come back, and I have contact with them. But the guy answering me the question, like Khalil, the sophomore studying computer science, who just wants to know his religion better,
Yeah.
like Khalil just knows me, and
Yeah.
I know these muftis,
Right.
so
So
I can
yeah.
be the one that connects these two groups together.
Inshallah.
And
Yeah.
we need people who, because people, there's also this idea that, actually, my Aqidah teacher in Jordan told me this. He's like, there are people who will curse the times. They'll say, "Oh, things are so bad. Like, we're not going anywhere. We're not
Mhm.
accomplishing anything." And the reality is that Allah says that there will be believers and disbelievers until the day of judgment.
Wow.
So until the end of times, there will be people on the
Right.
truth,
Yeah.
and at the end of times, there will be people who, no matter how much of an example you try to set, no matter how much you try to show them what Islam is through your actions, and it might just be because we're fallible
Yeah.
in our actions, but that they'll continue to disbelieve. And the reality is that it's the will of God that these two people will exist forever. So you
Right.
can't You shouldn't be someone who curses the times and says, "Oh, things are so
Mhm.
bad for Muslims." Normally, people who say that things are so bad for Muslims, the
Yeah.
reality is that they just haven't met people who are
Right.
learned. They choose to put themselves in situations where they're not able to meet learned people.
I think that if anything, we'll see less, a proportionally smaller amount of people being Muslim as Akhir Zaman approaches. They say, holding on to your religion would be like holding on to a hot coal. You'll see
Hmm.
that will be a trend.
Until the end of times,
Right.
yeah,
But then one thing you mentioned about, they can reach out to you and you can reach out to someone who's a mufti, but they don't know a mufti. I feel this just us being relatable. We post memes, we joke around, we have meme accounts. People
yeah,
see us as, funny people, and we're not
hmm,
very stiff. Sometimes the scholars, unfortunately, they've kind of lost this perfect tradition of being lighthearted. They're very, stiff, and you wouldn't want to talk to them. I get people in my DMs all the time, like a girl who has like an Instagram modeling, uh, you know, platform, like Instagram modeling page,
uh-huh.
like not someone you would expect would ask about religion as far as our stereotypical understanding of people,
Uh-huh.
unfortunately. And
Is that a
definitely not
flex?
definitely not
You got
someone
Instagram models in
yeah,
your
yeah,
DMs?
not famous ones, but not but my point is that type of person who's like an Instagram model and is thinking about spirituality, maybe they're Iranian
Uh-huh.
American or something, they're from California where they're all at, they wouldn't
Yeah,
message a sheikh in Iran, they wouldn't message a mufti, they would feel like, okay, whoa, this person would see my profile and be like, get out of my DMs. But they would
yeah,
message me, why do you believe in God? What do you think about God? Can I be a good Muslim and not be a hijabi at the same time? Like the other day, someone was talking to me about the hijab and they're struggling with it and they're trying to figure it out. And we were having a huge conversation. I feel like maybe they can approach me because I'm their age. I'm also Iranian. I'm from a similar background, but maybe they wouldn't message some Ayatollah, via email just to get back a 2 sentence reply. Hijab is mandatory. Allah knows best. So I think
yeah,
it's important for people like us to be intermediaries. And yeah, we're not super qualified. And maybe one day when we are super qualified, we will be too busy with the students and whatever to reply to a basic question or something like that. Then our students can do that. So
yeah,
inshallah, everyone has their place in helping everyone out, and we can rack up good deeds this way.
yeah, inshallah.
Inshallah. So we've been talking for about 2 hours. So I think now is a good time to stop it. Inshallah, we can pick up in maybe a few weeks with different topics and make this a recurring thing. I really like this conversation we had. So I'm
Okay,
gonna
yeah.
I'm gonna say salam alaikum to you here, unless you have any departing thoughts. Of course, if you have any.
No, I'm good. Alhamdulillah. Thank you for having me on.
Of course, man. I
Yeah,
love this. We need to do this
yeah.
again, inshallah.
Oh, I do have a departing thought.
Go ahead.
Coleman Barks. Coleman Barks. Yeah. So tell the viewers who Coleman Barks is.
So Coleman Barks, he is that's his born name. His Arabic Muslim name is Coleman Abdul Hamid Al Barki.
Uh-huh.
He's among the Kibar al Ulama in the Maliki school, and he's actually authoring like a groundbreaking text that's looking at their fiqh from a. No, I'm just joking. Coleman Barks is this baby boomer, hippie generation guy who studied under one of these new age mystics called Bawa Muhyiddin. See, in America in the hippie era, a ton of these hippies went eastward, and some of the mystics, really cultists like Osho, Bhagwan Rajneesh, and whatever, you might have heard of them, move
Mhm.
westward. And they saw this spiritual landscape that was kind of deprived of spirituality and very tired of this post-war cookie cutter reality, Protestant, whatever that they've set up, and saw these crazy hippies who wanted some Eastern stuff, with all kinds of colors and whatnot. So these cultists started, and not to say they're all cultists, a lot of them laid out framework that we're benefiting from. Alhamdulillah, a lot of Sufis and things from Africa and Middle East and South Asia. But this guy Coleman Barks was studying under Bawa Muhyiddin,
Mhm.
supposedly a Sufi sheikh from Sri Lanka. Don't know much about him, can't comment on him. But regardless, he doesn't seem like he was an expert in Persian poetry. So anyway, Bawa Muhyiddin, aware of the tradition, and most Sufi shuyukh who probably know Persian or Arabic, recommended that this guy read Rumi because he's the heavyweight, Sufi poet in the Persian tradition, or maybe just the tradition period. Who knows? Allahu alam. But he couldn't read him in Persian, so he went to read him in the original text. But he found the original text to be really suit jacketed because it was written in the Victorian era. To give you
Uh-huh.
a point, a lot of times we have this Protestant understanding of shuyukh, they're purist people. Rumi and the other sheikhs, they had a lot of stuff that we would consider racy in our modern Islamic understanding. They had anecdotes about sexual experiences. They had all kinds of naughty jokes, of course, with an Islamic moral at the end, but
Uh-huh.
nonetheless they use that imagery.
I have an
Right?
example from Ibn Arabi that I
Go
guess
ahead.
it'll like drive the point home.
Go ahead.
So Ibn Arabi talks about how in order to do good acts that you need to be aware of what's you need to have knowledge. And
Mhm.
the example he gives is he says once upon a time there was a Moroccan farmer, and he was a very sincere, very pious man, but he didn't have much knowledge. And he said that he bought a I want to say he bought a mule that was old and couldn't give milk or reproduce or anything. And he bought this animal, and someone asked him, why do you have this animal? And the Moroccan farmer says, I have a lot of sexual desires and I need something to let it out on. And then Ibn Arabi says, this man didn't even know the ruling on bestiality in Islam. And he's like, he thought he was doing a good thing,
Oh my
but he was
god.
actually doing something very
But
sinful.
there is an incredible similar
So,
analogy from
yeah.
the Mathnavi of Rumi. It's very
Uh-huh.
famous for being, one of the naughtiest ones or whatever from our modern perception, where this woman who's frustrated in her marriage spies a woman having sex with a donkey. Very similar.
Uh-huh.
And I think this was a phenomenon even to this day in some parts of the East. The goat effort thing that they always say about us. I think it exists in some rural places. It must have been a thing. My grandpa claimed that it existed when he was a child. That farmers were known for doing weird stuff with animals. I mean, humans are humans. Anyway, I mean, in America, it's not even illegal in some states to do bestiality. So anyway, this anecdote goes that she spies a woman having sexual intercourse with a mule, and a mule, its its penis is much larger than a male. So I mean that makes sense. But she spies her and doesn't want to tell her because for whatever reason, whatever she thinks maybe she won't let her or she's embarrassed. So then once that woman leaves, she waits a bit and then she goes and starts to do it herself. But then the mule's penis impales her and she dies.
Uh-huh.
And someone correct me if I'm wrong or forgive me for paraphrasing incorrectly. I think I read this 3 years ago. I need to reread it and be sure that I'm correct. But the way I understand it is the woman who was originally having sex with the beast had developed some sort of harness that or maybe wrapped it around the thing of the donkey to prevent the full blood flow.
Uh-huh.
Essentially, there was a device that made it so that a human and the donkey could have sexual relations without the donkey hurting the human.
Yo, I really hope this part of the video isn't taken out of context. That someone was like, these Muslim
Just
dudes
pull
are.
it out, yeah. Just two Muslim dudes being so the donkey. Anyway,
Oh, but yeah.
so
Anyways, continue.
yeah, so the Fox News pulls it up in 10 years. So these bestiality proponents in Islam. Anyway, so this woman dies, and the lesson is don't just see something and do it without having a teacher. And Rumi's a Sufi sheikh, he's a teacher with murids. The point is you should follow a teacher in whatever you do, even if it be, having sex with a donkey. Don't just
Uh huh.
go forward and attempt something, even if it seems easy, because you could go very, very wrong.
Uh huh.
And the Masnavi is full of these types of allegories. It's great.
Recent
Yeah,
example.
Jawad Mujaddadi is translating it, by the way. He's 4 books out of 6. It's the best
Uh
translation
huh.
I've ever seen. So if you guys are interested, go check it out. But anyway, so Coleman Barks is reading these these English Victorian translation of these texts. They're very old, they're very archaic. I mean, especially now. And they were so Victorian that these texts, they actually translated the racy parts into Latin so that the Awam couldn't read them because they were
Uh huh.
so straitjacketed. So these anecdotes when they would talk about sexual things, even though that's a part of life, Islam is very sex positive. We're not Protestants. We don't treat sex like this evil, awful thing. The ulama can be on the minbar talking about sex, talking about sexual rulings. Jafar as-Sadiq alayhi salam famously gave fatwa saying that, this act is halal, this act is haram. We're very open about these things.
Yeah.
So they translated it into Latin because they thought that it was too inappropriate to write in just the layperson's language, even though at the time not everyone was literate in whatever. So he finds this straight-jacketed Rumi and he's like, Khalas, I don't want this anymore, which to his credit, that's fair. But instead of learning Persian and doing a new translation, what he did was just took the old translations and just rewrote them in his own writing, but took out all the Islam. To be fair to the original translations, they were oriented scholars, but they respected Islam. At the time, there wasn't as much Islamophobia. Europe actually used to respect Islam, so they
Yeah.
were honest. If you read those old archaic translations, which I comb through them because of my page, they keep the Quranic quotes in there. They even reference the surahs that those Quranic quotes are from. They keep the analogies to the prophets. They have footnotes explaining who Qarun is and all those things, and who Muhammad and Ayaz and Khidr and
Uh-huh.
all these things. They're proper in their work. Kudos to
And
them.
Rumi, he cites the Quran over six. He cites over 6,000 verses of the Quran in his text.
Yeah,
So much that actually the book is right in front of me. But Shahab Ahmad in his book "What Is Islam," he says that the Masnavi of Rumi is effectively a commentary on the Quran
yeah,
because of all the
yeah,
verses of Quran that he cites.
yeah, yeah. They say there's a really famous Persian proverb that says Masnavi Molavi Quran Parsis, which means the Masnavi of Molavi is it's a Persian translation of the Quran. And there's
Uh-huh.
another one by Sheikh Bahai, who was a 17th century Persian mystic scholar. He said, Nemiguyam kyan ali janab. Has payambar vali darad kitab, which means I translated this. I won't say that man of exalted station is a prophet. No, but he has a revelation. So
Uh-huh.
that means that this is how highly we view him in our tradition, that if
Yeah.
only his book was given to him by God, we would say he was a prophet, right?
Someone
So
told me that in Azerbaijan, what you say is that in order to be a Muslim who understands your religion, you need to read the Quran and the Masnavi.
no, that's totally true. In fact, I was talking to an Iranian Muslim the other day, and he says you really need like 3 or 4 books to understand Islam. You need the Quran, Bukhari, and Muslim. You could just count that as just one book, Hadith collection, let's say, and
Uh-huh.
then the Mathnawi of Rumi, and then maybe one book by Ghazali, like one of his
Uh-huh.
main texts. You need like those four for a lay Muslim just to get the gist of those, and you understand Islam
Uh-huh.
well enough for you. But
The Alchemy
anyway,
of Happiness by
yeah, no,
Ghazali.
that was literally a Kimyai Saudat. That was the Alchemy of
Uh-huh.
Happiness. That was the book he said that
It's
was the
written
book.
in Persian too. It's not in Arabic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So of course he would say that. So then, anyway, so he finds his translations and they're all awful. So what he does is, first of all, he takes it and he makes it modern. He makes it free verse, no rhyme, no meter. He takes out all the references to Islam, but leaves the ones that are Christian compatible, like the Mary, Jesus, Joseph references,
Oh, really?
alayhum assalam. Yeah. So he
Uh,
removes all of the Quranic references, the Muslim references,
that are only
yeah,
Muslim that
yeah.
don't.
So
Yeah.
one of the most famous quotes. First of all of his quotes are abound and they're mistranslated. It makes me cringe seeing them on social media. They're all wrong, and people clueless whites just repost them, and Muslims even too. Sometimes they get retranslated into Arabic. It's a hot mess. But anyway, one of them is between a field of wrongdoing and right doing. Between wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field, and I'll meet you there. And the most
Uh-huh.
recent coming up of this was when Ivanka Trump tweeted that when they met with the Taliban. Because it's funny because, Rumi's from Afghanistan, Taliban's from Afghanistan, whatever, yeah.
Uh-huh.
But the real translation of that is Baina Kufr Iman Sahrais, Baina On Sodais, which is saying between Kufr, disbelief, heresy, and Iman, belief in Islam, there is a wadi. I'll see you at that wadi. That's where the mystics are. And saying essentially we're not fighting over these like, oh, you're a kafir, you're a moment, things like that. We're worried about higher things in spirituality. Whereas this guy translates to between wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll see you there.
Uh-huh.
There's no Islam in there, and there you can go
You
on
know where I saw
Wikipedia.
this
Yeah,
quote?
what?
I saw this at like one of these bougie restaurants in
Oh
Jordan. It
yeah,
was on
oh
the
yeah.
menu.
No,
Yeah.
that's all. Even in cafes in America that are like hipster, you'll see these, and there's so many more examples. My good friend Zarar did a story about it. I'm having a podcast coming out with him too, inshallah, more than the one we did. But you find these all over the place. Muslims share them too. It's just always ripping the Islam out of it. So there's this one famous Quran verse where God tells us that our body parts will bear witness against us on the day of judgment. I don't remember the verse or the wording of it, unfortunately. My
Hmm.
memory is going with this Corona stuff. So there's a Rumi poem that's just a Persian expansion on this, essentially saying that same idea. And the Rumi poem's in depth, and the Wikipedia actually compares these two, the Barks translation. So God bless whatever scholar pulled out the proper English translation and the Barks translation. And the Barks translation just like, first of all, pulls out all the Quran and over sexualizes it. So Rumi, in his thing, he says all your body parts will testify against you, and he implies your sexual body parts. But Barks translates it something as like, and my body and my hands will say, my feet will say, I went places I shouldn't have, and your genitals will say that too. It's just like a very and he has ones that just made up. It's like the best satisfaction is like something about sex or like getting slapped. Like it's just ridiculous. Like if you read the book, it's almost appalling what he's done to Rumi. I feel like we should take offense to it as Muslims. He's just like
Uh-huh.
secularized and turned this rukn, this column, as we say, this pillar of Islamic thought. He's just turned him into like a vaguely secular, like pothead hippie, like Auzubillah, like
Mhm.
pothead hippie, just like sitting in a cafe offering like vague spiritual advice. So
So,
yeah.
so my theory on Barks is that the reason he's popular is by the barakah of his sheikh, because his
Bawa Muhyiddin or Rumi.
Bawa Muhyiddin is someone who is like amazing. I don't know that much
Really?
about Barks. I'm not like an expert on Rumi by any means. I actually
Mm-hmm.
have the Rumi daybook in my house. I don't even know who
Really?
translated that. Is
I
that
think
by
Coleman
Barks?
Barks. I think that's by Barks. So what you
Oh,
should have is, it's not with me, but Jawad Mujaddadi's translation of the Masnavi, he's 4 books into 6. He
uh-huh,
keeps the rhyme, he keeps the meter for I think the most part, and he keeps the Quran. He references the Quran and Hadith references
uh-huh.
in the footnotes, so you can actually get it's good. But
But
anyway, go ahead.
Baba Mohiuddin didn't even speak English, and he was brought to the United States by like request of two people. And when he first comes to the United States, there's all this New Age stuff happening. So he prays and he does like Muslim stuff, but he doesn't make his followers become Muslim right away. And whatever religion they are, he'll engage with them on that religion. And he starts giving them, you know how these hippies have these mantras? He says your mantra is to say La ilaha illallah.
No
So all
way.
these white people, like hippies, are like saying La ilaha illallah. Baba Mohiuddin, for 13 years, all he teaches them is like La ilaha illallah and
There's
like
no
that
doubt.
sort of stuff. Then 13 years later, he establishes a masjid and he introduces them to the five pillars of Islam. And this is
Wow.
exactly what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ did.
So,
He
yeah.
taught Tawheed, he taught
13
the
for
oneness of God
yeah, for a decade or something and
of,
some
for
change.
13
13
years
years. Yeah.
exactly, and then he taught everything else.
Yeah.
And Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she said if the first two things the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught the people was that you couldn't drink alcohol and you couldn't have sex
They
outside
wouldn't
of
have become
marriage,
Muslim. They
no one
wouldn't.
would have become Muslim. So Bawa has this like culture of gradualism in the way he teaches, and because of him, a lot of people ended up becoming Muslim. And
Wow. So he
some
was
of
one of those people who laid the framework of legitimate Islam in the
yeah,
West.
and some of Bawa's murids will even like if you ask them if they're Muslim, they'll be like, I pray 5 times a day. I've been on Hajj. I fast during Ramadan. They get up for tahajjud. They do all of these sorts of things, and then they'll say something like, "I can only aspire to be Muslim because Muslim means someone
Wow.
who submits to Allah." They're like, "Muslim is too high of a station for me," but they believe
Wow.
in the Shahada. They believe in all these sorts of things, right? So
Right.
Barks, the way he encounters Bawa is he has a dream where he sees Bawa in the dream, and he doesn't know who this man is. And somehow he finds out who he is, and a year later he meets him in Philadelphia, and he becomes his murid. And I'm pretty sure Coleman Barks is a Muslim, but he's of that school of Bawa's murids who won't like explicitly say they're Muslims,
Really?
even though they believe in Allah, they believe in His
No way.
prophets, they believe in His books,
So
all that sort of
to
stuff.
give him some credit, now that you've given some positive talk, a lot of
Yeah,
people who message me on my page have come from him. So
through Barks. Yeah,
although some people just stop it right there, they're happy with whatever they have with through him. Some people see that that's not all, or they want more, and they keep looking. So some people, subhanAllah, have found his poetry of Rumi and then found the original Rumi and then found more shuyukh and found Ibn Arabi and then become Muslim or Sufi.
yeah,
Or people find their way, they come to my page and I read Coleman Barks, but I wanted something more original, the text more overtly Muslim, more essentially accurate or academic,
uh,
and not so paraphrased. And they come to me. So alhamdulillah, he's a bab. He's opening a door for some
exactly.
people.
I feel like Coleman Barks is, whether it's by his knowing or whether it's by his sheikh, Bawa Mohiddin Rahimullah, I feel
Mm,
like through Barks, a lot of people have been exposed to real Rumi, who otherwise, if Rumi
right.
wasn't presented in this new age fashion,
That's
they
true.
wouldn't be exposed to
So
him.
Rumi has actually become the best selling poet in America, if you can believe
Mhm.
that a
Yeah.
Muslim guy is the best selling poet in this country.
But likely as a result of, could you say
No,
that's
just
because of
no.
Barks?
No. I easily. It's because of him. His books are the
Uh,
best selling ones.
yeah.
The Essential Rumi is the best selling one, and I mean by far. I mean Americans don't really read poetry like Muslims do. Every Muslim, every Desi person or Iranian or Arab has poetry all memorized in their head, and they send it on WhatsApp and they quote it every day. I mean, Americans
Yeah.
don't really do that. They can't even quote one poem. I'm not talking about rap. Of course, that's poetry. I mean, like
Yeah, I was gonna say we got rap music.
traditional poetry, so to
Uh,
speak, especially religious poetry. I mean, yeah, there's Kanye and stuff. There's references to religion and rap, but it's not the thing. It's not like it's not a spiritual music, so to speak.
mhm.
So in a way, yeah, there's Baraka and what he's doing, but we would hope that that's the start and not the end. That they
That's
don't just
yeah,
read that book and then
exactly.
they're done with Rumi. We would
Yeah,
hope that that gets them thirsty and then they go for the real mashrab, the real source of water, the ayn, the chishme, the
the
spring of
spring.
water, the
Yeah,
spring. Yeah.
yeah,
So inshallah, it's a door because when you're dealing with someone coming from a Protestant Islamophobic society, you can't just hand them the Masnavi that's full of Quran quotations and all this stuff that they can't process. I understand they need to get in somehow, and then once they're in the door, inshallah, they'll like it and stay. But
yeah.
we'll see.
There's a saying. I think it comes from Imam Mu'tadim Muhammad, who was the son of Elijah Muhammad,
Yeah, and he became
who
a mainstream. He went to Azhar, right, and became a
yeah,
mainstream
he converted the people after Malcolm left. Some people joined him and became
Muslims.
actual Muslims.
So it was
And,
Louis Farrakhan or Farrakhan
yeah.
that kept NOI as the original NOI. He kept that alive.
So when Elijah Muhammad dies in 1975, the people who didn't follow Malcolm, they follow Elijah Muhammad's son and become Sunni Muslims. And Louis Farrakhan actually followed Elijah Muhammad's son for a couple of years and then restarts the Nation of Islam.
Yeah, restarts. I like his
But
speaking style. As regardless of our fiqh disagreements, the dude's an
yeah,
amazing speaker.
yeah, the man is nuts, but he's
He
charismatic.
is nuts, man. Yeah, that's very true. That the anti-Semitism, the conspiracy theories, all that stuff, whatever. Put that aside. Just looking at his just strictly his speaking ability, it's pretty good.
Yeah,
Although it's really interesting to me how that group is a synthesis of Christianity and Islam.
yeah.
So it's
I went
very
to one of
interesting.
their Sunday services
No
once.
way.
It
Yeah,
was
their services are on Sunday. It's
yeah,
very
it's so
Christianized.
Christian. And Farrakhan, in his speech, he committed so much kufr. He broke so much Islamic
Really?
orthodoxy that I was
Can you just
astounded.
give it like a small example?
He would let's he said, let's see, what did he say that was crazy? Oh, well, this isn't kufr, but this is just crazy. He compared Malcolm X to an aborted fetus, and he said that
They're still upset over that?
he said Malcolm X was growing under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, but then he said when he left the classroom, then he wasn't able to reach his full potential. And he says he was an aborted fetus. And then the second thing
Uh,
that he said is that he said that Elijah Muhammad is the final prophet, which is,
yeah, that's just straight up
kuf-
kufr. Yeah,
kufr. And he said all of the
kufr
other
akbar,
prophets,
not even asghar. It's like akbar kufr, like takes you out
yeah.
of Islam.
And then he said all of the prophets prior were children compared to Elijah Muhammad,
Oh wow,
which is crazy. This
wow,
is
that's
Savior's Day Part
insane.
2 speech, if anyone wants to corroborate. But anyways, where were Imam Muwaddin Muhammad, Elijah
Yeah.
Muhammad's son, who transitions them over to Sunni Islam, and he
Hmm.
has like over 50 times the followers that Farrakhan had. But he didn't say crazy things, so he never ended up in the news. He was just, building people,
Wow,
doing the
subhanallah.
tazkiyah, building a strong community. And he said that if you give meat to an infant, the infant will get sick. The food of it's an Arabic saying also that the food of adults is poison when given to children.
Yeah.
So I feel like Coleman Barks, he's giving
Wow.
people
Yeah.
baby food in a way, and people
That's
like
true. Yeah.
you, people like what's his name, Jawad Mujarradi, they're giving
That's my last name, Mujaddidi.
Mujaddadi, they're giving like adult food. But in
Right.
order to get the
Inshallah. Yeah.
adult food, for some people,
You
they
need the
have to
baby
go
food
through.
as well. Yeah. You need to take the baby steps. Right.
Yeah,
Wow. That's incredible. Well, I guess maybe I feel like I've been too harsh on him now.
yeah. I feel like people are too harsh on Barks.
You're right. Maybe if we look at that favorable angle, inshallah, husna then, assume the best intentions,
Yeah,
husna niyyah. Hopefully he has those intentions, as you say. But maybe if that's the case, then I should ease up
yeah.
on it a little
In the
bit.
words of Imam Jafar Sadiq, make
Yes,
70 excuses for your brothers, and
brother.
if you can't, then the issue is
Okay,
with you, not with
we'll
him.
assume that he's our brother then. All right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
All right. It was really good talking to you, man. Thank you so much for coming and talking to me. I love this. We should do this more, especially
Yeah,
nowadays when
always.
we're not seeing anyone. So, and it's 12, it's almost 1 in the morning too. So I'll bid you farewell. Assalamu alaikum, Habib.
Okay, walaikum assalam.